Climate change represents perhaps the most profound ecological experiment in human history, quietly rewriting the rules that have governed life on Earth for millennia. As temperatures shift and weather patterns dance to new rhythms, every organism from the smallest soil bacteria to the largest mammals must adapt to a world in flux. This transformation touches every corner of the biosphere, creating a cascade of changes that ripple through ecosystems in ways both subtle and dramatic. The story of how our changing climate reshapes the web of life is one of disruption and adaptation, loss and unexpected resilience. To understand how climate change transforms ecology, we must first grasp the fundamental physics driving our planet's warming. The story begins with something as basic as sunlight striking Earth's surface, yet unfolds into a complex symphony of energy exchanges that governs the conditions for all life. Earth receives energy from the sun, primarily as visible light and ultraviolet radiation. This incoming solar energy warms the planet's surface, which then radiates heat back toward space in the form of infrared radiation, or what we commonly think of as heat waves. Under natural conditions, this energy balance maintains Earth's temperature within a range suitable for liquid water and the chemistry of life. The atmosphere, however, is not a passive player in this exchange. Certain gases, naturally present in the air, absorb infrared radiation, trapping some of the heat that would otherwise escape to space. This greenhouse effect is essential for life as we know it. Without these heat-trapping gases, Earth's average temperature would hover around -18 degrees Celsius, far too cold for most biological processes. Instead, the natural greenhouse effect warms our planet to a comfortable average of about 15 degrees Celsius. The primary greenhouse gases include water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and various fluorinated compounds. Each molecule of these gases acts like a tiny antenna, absorbing specific wavelengths of infrared radiation. When they absorb this energy, the molecules vibrate and eventually re-emit the heat in random directions. Some of this re-emitted energy travels back toward Earth's surface, effectively recycling heat that would have otherwise been lost to space. Carbon dioxide deserves particular attention because of its central role in current climate change. This molecule's structure allows it to absorb infrared radiation at wavelengths around 15 micrometers, which happens to be a major component of the heat radiated by Earth's surface. Before industrialization, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations remained relatively stable at around 280 parts per million for thousands of years. Human activities, primarily the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, have increased this concentration to over 420 parts per million, a rise of more than 50%. Methane, though present in much smaller quantities, is remarkably effective at trapping heat. A single methane molecule absorbs infrared radiation about 25 times more effectively than a carbon dioxide molecule over a century-long timescale. Sources of methane include natural wetlands, agriculture, livestock, and the extraction of fossil fuels. While methane concentrations are measured in parts per billion rather than parts per million, their impact on the greenhouse effect is substantial. The relationship between greenhouse gas concentrations and global temperature is not linear. As concentrations increase, the warming effect follows what scientists call a logarithmic curve. This means that the first few doublings of carbon dioxide concentration produce the most dramatic temperature changes, while subsequent increases have progressively smaller effects. However, even these smaller incremental changes can push Earth's climate system across critical thresholds. Global temperature increases, while often discussed in terms of averages, manifest differently across the planet's surface. The Arctic experiences warming at roughly twice the global average, a phenomenon known as Arctic amplification. This occurs partly because melting ice and snow expose darker surfaces that absorb more sunlight, creating a positive feedback loop. As white, reflective ice gives way to dark ocean water or land surface, more solar energy is absorbed, leading to further warming and more ice loss. The oceans play a crucial role in Earth's energy balance, absorbing over 90% of the excess heat trapped by greenhouse gases. Water has a high heat capacity, meaning it takes significant energy to warm it up. This thermal inertia means that ocean temperatures rise more slowly than land temperatures, but they also retain heat for much longer periods. The vast thermal mass of the oceans means that even if greenhouse gas emissions stopped today, global temperatures would continue rising for decades as the oceans slowly equilibrate with the new atmospheric conditions. Ocean absorption of carbon dioxide creates an additional layer of complexity. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it forms carbonic acid, making the oceans more acidic. This ocean acidification proceeds independently of temperature changes and affects marine life in ways distinct from warming. The chemistry of seawater becomes less favorable for organisms that build shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate, including corals, mollusks, and many types of plankton. The warming atmosphere also holds more water vapor, since warm air can contain more moisture than cool air. This creates another feedback loop, as water vapor itself is a potent greenhouse gas. For every degree Celsius of warming, the atmosphere can hold about 7% more moisture. This additional water vapor amplifies the initial warming, but it also changes precipitation patterns and storm intensity in complex ways. Regional climate patterns emerge from the interaction between global energy imbalances and Earth's rotation, topography, and ocean currents. The jet stream, a high-altitude river of fast-moving air, helps distribute heat between equatorial and polar regions. As the Arctic warms faster than lower latitudes, the temperature difference that drives the jet stream decreases, causing it to meander more dramatically. These meandering patterns can lock weather systems in place for extended periods, leading to persistent heat waves, droughts, or flooding events. Mountain ranges create their own climate patterns by forcing air masses upward, where they cool and release moisture as precipitation. As global temperatures rise, the elevation at which precipitation falls as snow rather than rain increases, affecting water storage in mountain snowpacks. Many regions depend on snowmelt for their water supply, and earlier melting can create water scarcity later in the growing season. The concept of tipping points represents perhaps the most concerning aspect of climate physics. These are thresholds where relatively small additional warming triggers large, potentially irreversible changes in climate systems. Examples include the complete loss of Arctic sea ice, the collapse of major ice sheets, or the shutdown of ocean circulation patterns like the Gulf Stream. Once crossed, these tipping points can become self-reinforcing, leading to additional warming regardless of human actions. Feedback loops operate throughout the climate system, either amplifying warming trends or, in some cases, temporarily dampening them. Positive feedbacks accelerate change. As permafrost thaws in the Arctic, it releases stored carbon dioxide and methane, adding to atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. As forests experience more frequent droughts and fires, They release carbon instead of storing it, further accelerating warming. Negative feedbacks can provide temporary buffers against change, though they are often overwhelmed by positive feedbacks. Increased plant growth in some regions, due to higher carbon dioxide concentrations, can temporarily remove more carbon from the atmosphere. However, this effect often diminishes as plants become limited by nutrients, water, or temperature stress. The timescales of climate change present unique challenges for both natural systems and human understanding. While greenhouse gas concentrations can change relatively quickly, the full temperature response takes decades to centuries to unfold. Ice sheets respond even more slowly, potentially taking thousands of years to fully adjust to new temperature conditions. This lag means that the climate changes we observe today result partly from emissions decades in the past, and that future changes are already locked in by current atmospheric conditions. Understanding these physical principles provides the foundation for comprehending how climate change affects living systems. The seemingly abstract concepts of radiative forcing, feedback loops, and thermal inertia translate into very real changes in the environments where organisms live, reproduce, and compete for resources. Temperature increases, shifting precipitation patterns, and changing extreme weather events create new selective pressures that reshape ecological communities in ways both predictable and surprising. As we delve deeper into these ecological transformations, the physics of climate change serves as the underlying mechanism driving everything from shifts in flowering times to the reorganization of entire food webs. The energy imbalances created by greenhouse gas emissions propagate through Earth systems, ultimately manifesting as the ecological disruptions and adaptations that define our changing biosphere. The rhythms of life on Earth have been choreographed by seasonal patterns for millions of years. Trees know when to leaf out, birds when to migrate, and flowers when to bloom through an intricate biological calendar that evolved in harmony with predictable climate cycles. Climate change disrupts these ancient rhythms, creating temporal mismatches that ripple through ecosystems in ways both subtle and profound. Phenology, the study of recurring biological events and their timing, reveals how deeply organisms are synchronized with seasonal cues. Temperature, daylight duration, precipitation patterns, and other environmental signals trigger biological processes with remarkable precision. A cherry tree begins forming flower buds based on accumulated temperature over preceding months. Migratory birds initiate their journeys in response to changing day length. Arctic ground squirrels emerge from hibernation when soil temperatures reach specific thresholds. These timing relationships evolved over thousands of generations, creating finely tuned biological clocks that maximize survival and reproductive success. Spring arrives, and the natural world awakens in a carefully orchestrated sequence. First, the earliest flowering plants like skunk cabbage push through snow, followed by tree buds swelling, then a progression of wildflowers, each timing their emergence to avoid competition while ensuring pollinators are available. Climate change accelerates this biological calendar unevenly. Warming temperatures advance spring events across much of the temperate world, but different species respond at different rates. Some plants now flower weeks earlier than they did several decades ago, while their pollinators may shift their active periods by only days. This temporal mismatch can leave flowers without pollinators and pollinators without adequate food sources. The relationship between temperature and biological timing follows predictable patterns for many species. Plant phenologists have documented that for each degree Celsius of warming, spring events typically advance by about 5 to 6 days. Leaf emergence, flowering, and fruit ripening all shift earlier, but the magnitude varies among species. Early flowering plants like willows and maples show stronger responses to temperature than late flowering species, which often depend more on daylight cues that remain constant despite climate change. Tree phenology illustrates these shifting patterns clearly. Across European forests, researchers have tracked leaf emergence dates for decades, revealing advances of 10 to 15 days since the 1,960 seconds. American deciduous forests show similar patterns, with sugar maples, oaks, and birches leafing out progressively earlier. This earlier leaf emergence extends growing seasons, potentially increasing forest productivity, but it also creates vulnerability to late frost events that can damage tender new growth. The complexity of phenological shifts becomes apparent when examining plant pollinator relationships. Bees, butterflies, and other pollinators depend on sequential blooming of different plant species to provide nectar and pollen throughout their active season. When early flowering plants advance their timing more rapidly than late flowering species, it can create gaps in resource availability. Native bees, that time, their emergence to coincide with specific wildflowers, may find themselves active when their preferred food sources have already finished blooming. Some pollinator species demonstrate remarkable flexibility in adjusting their timing. Mason bees advance their emergence by several days for each degree of warming, closely tracking the earlier flowering of their preferred food plants. However, other species show little phenological plasticity, maintaining emergence times controlled primarily by photoperiod rather than temperature. These species face increasing mismatches with their food sources as warming continues. Bird migration provides another lens through which to observe phenological disruption. Many migratory species initiate their journeys based on photoperiod cues that remain unchanged by climate change. Day length at any given date stays constant, but the temperature and food availability at destination sites shift earlier each year. This creates a fundamental timing problem for species that evolved to arrive when conditions are optimal. Long-distance migrants face particular challenges because they cannot assess conditions at distant destinations when deciding when to begin migration. Arctic breeding birds like red knots may arrive at northern breeding grounds to find that peak insect abundance now occurs weeks before their arrival. The brief window of optimal breeding conditions in the Arctic means that even small timing mismatches can dramatically reduce reproductive success. Some bird species show adaptive responses to changing phenology. European blackbirds now begin migration earlier and have shortened migration distances, with some populations becoming year-round residents in areas where they previously migrated. Great tits advance their egg laying to better synchronize with peak caterpillar abundance, demonstrating the potential for rapid evolutionary responses to phenological shifts. The cascading effects of phenological mismatches extend beyond individual species interactions. In forest ecosystems, the timing of insect emergence relative to bird breeding affects pest control services. If insectivorous birds miss peak caterpillar abundance due to timing mismatches, it can lead to increased herbivore damage on trees. This creates feedback effects on forest health and carbon storage capacity. Aquatic ecosystems experience their own phenological disruptions. Lake ice-out dates now occur weeks earlier across the northern hemisphere, fundamentally altering the timing of aquatic food webs. Phytoplankton blooms begin earlier, but zooplankton that feed on them may not shift their timing correspondingly. Fish spawning, which often depends on specific temperature thresholds, advances into periods when food resources for juvenile fish may not yet be available. Stream ecosystems face additional complexity as warming temperatures accelerate insect development rates. Mayflies, caddisflies, and other aquatic insects complete their life cycles faster in warmer water, potentially creating multiple generations per year where only one previously occurred. This can disrupt the timing of fish feeding and reproduction, which evolved around predictable insect emergence patterns. Mountain ecosystems provide natural experiments in phenological shifts across elevation gradients. Lower elevations warm faster than high elevations, creating advancing waves of biological activity moving upslope. Alpine plants that depend on synchronized timing with pollinators across elevation ranges may find these relationships disrupted as warming proceeds unevenly up mountainsides. The study of historical phenological records reveals the magnitude of changes already underway. Henry David Thoreau's meticulous observations of flowering times around Walden Pond in the 1,850 seconds provide a baseline for modern comparisons. Many species now flower 10 to 14 days earlier than in Thoreau's time, with the most temperature-sensitive species showing the greatest advances. Similar historical records from Japan document cherry blossom festivals dating back over 1,000 years. These cultural records show that peak cherry bloom now occurs about a week earlier than during medieval times, with the most rapid changes occurring in recent decades. Such long-term records provide crucial perspective on the acceleration of phenological change. Agricultural systems both contribute to and suffer from phenological disruption. Crop varieties selected for specific growing seasons may become maladapted as climate zones shift. Earlier, last frost dates and later first frost dates extend potential growing seasons, but they can also increase exposure to pest species that complete additional generations in warmer conditions. Fruit and nut crops face particular challenges from disrupted chill requirements. Many temperate fruit trees require a specific number of hours below certain temperatures during winter dormancy to break bud properly in spring. Insufficient winter chilling can lead to delayed, uneven, or reduced flowering and fruit set. Apple and cherry orchards are already experiencing these effects in warming regions. The phenology of extreme weather events adds another layer of complexity. Heat waves, droughts, and severe storms are shifting in timing as well as intensity. Early season heat waves can force premature flowering, leaving plants vulnerable to later cold snaps. Drought timing, relative to critical growth periods, determines its impact on plant survival and reproduction. Some species demonstrate remarkable phenological plasticity, adjusting their timing across multiple aspects of their life cycles. Others appear locked into rigid patterns controlled by evolutionary constraints. Understanding which species can adapt and which cannot becomes crucial for predicting ecosystem changes and conservation planning. The concept of phenological mismatch extends beyond simple predator-prey or plant-pollinator relationships to encompass entire community-level timing. The temporal organization of ecological communities evolved to minimize competition and maximize resource use efficiency. As these temporal niches shift at different rates, it creates opportunities for novel interactions while disrupting established relationships. Research into phenological genetics reveals that timing traits often have complex inheritance patterns, involving multiple genes. This complexity can limit the speed of evolutionary responses to changing climate conditions. Species with shorter generation times and higher genetic variation in timing traits show greater potential for adaptive evolution. Climate change models predict continued acceleration of spring phenology, with larger advances at higher latitudes where warming is most pronounced. These projections suggest that current phenological mismatches represent early stages of much larger disruptions to the temporal organization of ecological communities. Understanding these timing shifts provides the foundation for examining how organisms respond by shifting their geographic ranges, the focus of our next exploration. As climate zones shift across Earth's surface, they carry with them the invisible boundaries that define where species can survive and thrive. These climate envelopes, the combination of temperature, precipitation, and seasonal patterns that each species requires, are moving poleward and upslope at rates unprecedented in recent geological history. For the countless organisms that call Earth home, this movement presents a stark choice: migrate with their preferred climate conditions or adapt to the new conditions arriving at their current locations. The concept of climate tracking reveals how species attempt to maintain their position within suitable climate space as that space moves across the landscape. Species distributions have always been dynamic, expanding and contracting with natural climate cycles over thousands of years. Ice ages pushed temperate species toward the equator, while interglacial periods allowed them to recolonize higher latitudes. The current warming, however, proceeds at a pace that compresses these millennial processes into decades, testing the limits of species' abilities to respond. Plant species provide some of the clearest examples of range shifts in response to climate change. Trees, despite their sessile nature, migrate through the differential survival and reproduction of individuals at range margins. At the northern or upslope edges of species ranges, warming temperatures create new opportunities for establishment and growth. Seedlings that would have perished from cold stress in previous decades now survive to maturity, gradually extending the population boundary. The sugar maple exemplifies this northward march of temperate forest species. Across eastern North America, sugar maple populations show increased recruitment at their northern range limits, while experiencing stress and mortality at southern boundaries. Young maples establish successfully in areas of southern Canada where they previously could not survive winter temperatures. Meanwhile, southern populations face increasing drought stress and competition from more heat-tolerant species. Forest dynamics operate on timescales that make range shifts particularly visible to long-term studies. The northeastern United States has experienced a general migration of tree species northward, with northern hardwood species like paper birch and balsam fir retreating from their southern range limits while expanding northward. Southern species, including red maple and various oak species, advance into territories previously dominated by more cold-adapted trees. These forest transitions rarely occur as simple species replacements. Instead, they create novel forest compositions as species with different migration rates intermingle during transitional periods. Fast migrating species may arrive at new locations before slow migrating species have departed, creating temporary communities with no historical precedent. These novel assemblages challenge traditional concepts of stable forest types and complicate conservation planning. Animal species demonstrate more rapid and obvious responses to shifting climate conditions due to their mobility. Bird distributions provide particularly well documented examples of climate tracking. The Christmas bird count, a citizen science project spanning over a century, reveals systematic northward shifts in winter bird distributions across North America. Species after species shows the same pattern, range boundaries moving poleward as winter temperatures moderate. The northern cardinal, once restricted to the southeastern United States, now breeds regularly into southern Canada. Purple finches have shifted their winter distributions northward by hundreds of kilometers over recent decades. These range expansions often occur gradually, with pioneering individuals exploring new territories and establishing breeding populations when conditions prove suitable. Mountain ecosystems create natural laboratories for studying elevational range shifts. As temperatures warm, isotherms migrate upslope, and many species track these moving temperature zones. Alpine plants face particularly dramatic challenges because mountains provide finite vertical space. Species adapted to the coolest conditions have nowhere higher to migrate as their climate envelopes move beyond available habitat. The American pika illustrates the predicament facing high elevation specialists. These small mammals inhabit rocky talus slopes in mountain ranges across western North America. As summer temperatures increase, pikas face thermal stress that can prove lethal. They respond by shifting to higher elevations and more northerly aspects, but these refugia become increasingly limited as warming continues. Local extinctions have occurred at the lowest elevations of their range, and entire mountain populations face potential extirpation. Butterfly distributions respond rapidly to temperature changes, making them sensitive indicators of climate-driven range shifts. The Edith's checker spot butterfly has shifted its range northward and upslope throughout western North America. Populations at the southern and low elevation margins of the range have gone extinct, while new populations establish at higher latitudes and elevations. This pattern of range retraction differs from simple range expansion because suitable habitat disappears from one portion of the range, even as it becomes available elsewhere. Marine species face their own challenges in tracking suitable climate conditions. Ocean temperatures change more slowly than terrestrial temperatures due to water's high heat capacity, but marine organisms often have narrow thermal tolerance ranges. Fish species in the North Atlantic have shifted their distributions northward by an average of several kilometers per year, with some species moving hundreds of kilometers over recent decades. The distribution of Atlantic cod provides a commercially important example of marine range shifts. Cod populations have declined dramatically in southern portions of their range, while maintaining stability or even increasing in northern areas. Warmer water temperatures stress cod directly and also affect their food sources, creating cascading changes throughout marine food webs. Fishing communities have observed these changes directly as once abundant species become rare, while previously uncommon northern species appear in their catches. The speed of range shifts varies dramatically among species and depends on multiple factors, including dispersal ability, generation time, and habitat requirements. Mobile species like birds and butterflies can track climate changes relatively quickly, while sessile organisms like trees migrate much more slowly. This creates temporal lags between climate change and biological responses that can persist for decades or centuries. Habitat fragmentation complicates range shifts by creating barriers to migration. Species attempting to track their climate envelopes often encounter landscapes fragmented by human development, agriculture, and other land uses. Roads, cities, and agricultural fields can block migration routes for many species, preventing them from reaching suitable new habitat, even when such habitat exists. The concept of climate velocity quantifies how fast species would need to migrate to track their current climate conditions. In some regions, especially mountains and coastal areas, short distances separate different climate zones, resulting in relatively low climate velocities. Flat areas like the Great Plains require much longer migration distances to track equivalent climate changes, creating high climate velocities that may exceed many species' dispersal abilities. Connectivity between habitats becomes crucial for facilitating range shifts. Natural corridors along river valleys, mountain ridges, and coastlines provide pathways for species migration. Conservation strategies increasingly focus on maintaining and restoring these corridors to enable climate tracking. Wildlife crossings over highways, reforestation of riparian zones, and protection of stepping stone habitats all contribute to landscape connectivity. Some species demonstrate remarkable flexibility in their range shift responses. Red foxes have expanded their ranges northward into Arctic territories previously dominated by Arctic foxes. These expansions involve not just geographic movement, but also behavioral and dietary adaptations to new environments. Red foxes in the Arctic exploit different food sources and den sites than their temperate counterparts, showing the potential for ecological flexibility during range shifts. Marine ecosystems experience range shifts along both latitudinal and depth gradients. As surface waters warm, some species migrate to deeper, cooler waters, while others move poleward. Deep water species may have limited options for avoiding warming because ocean depths have finite capacity to provide thermal refugia. The three-dimensional nature of marine habitat creates complex patterns of range shifts that differ substantially from terrestrial systems. The timing of range shifts relative to other ecological changes creates additional complexity. Species that migrate successfully to new areas may find that their traditional food sources, competitors, or predators have not made corresponding movements. This temporal mismatch can leave migrating species without the ecological relationships they depend upon, forcing rapid adaptation or potentially leading to population declines, even in climatically suitable new habitat. Range shifts also create new species interactions as previously separated species come into contact. Northern and southern species that evolved in isolation may suddenly find themselves competing for resources or potentially hybridizing. These novel interactions can have unpredictable consequences for community dynamics and evolutionary processes. The study of past climate changes provides insight into how species have responded to rapid environmental shifts throughout Earth's history. Fossil pollen records show that individual tree species migrated at different rates following glacial periods, creating temporary forest communities unlike any currently existing. These historical precedents suggest that current range shifts may produce similarly novel ecosystem configurations. Understanding range shift patterns becomes essential for conservation planning in a changing climate. Protected areas designed to preserve current species distributions may become less effective if target species migrate beyond reserve boundaries. Dynamic conservation strategies that anticipate range shifts and protect migration corridors offer more promise for maintaining biodiversity in a changing world. The success or failure of range shifts ultimately determines which species persist in their current form and which face local or global extinction. These migration attempts represent one of the most fundamental responses to climate change, setting the stage for examining what happens when species reach the limits of their dispersal abilities or encounter insurmountable barriers to migration. Mountains rise from the landscape like islands in the sky, their peaks harboring unique communities of life, adapted to the thin air, intense solar radiation, and extreme temperature fluctuations found at high elevations. These alpine environments serve as natural refugia during warm periods and as stepping stones for species during climate transitions. Yet, as global temperatures climb, mountain ecosystems face a fundamental geometric constraint. There is only so much mountain to climb before species quite literally run out of space. The vertical zonation of mountain ecosystems compresses multiple climate zones into relatively short distances. A journey from a mountain's base to its summit traverses the ecological equivalent of traveling from temperate regions toward the poles, with temperature dropping approximately 6.5 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 meters of elevation gained. This temperature gradient creates distinct life zones stacked vertically up the mountainside, each supporting characteristic plant and animal communities adapted to specific elevational bands. Lower montane zones typically support mixed forests, dominated by species that can tolerate moderate cold and seasonal snow. As elevation increases, these give way to subalpine forests of cold-adapted conifers like spruces and firs, trees whose narrow, pointed crowns shed snow efficiently and whose needle-like leaves minimize water loss in the dry mountain air. Higher still, trees become stunted and widely spaced in the Krumholtz zone, where constant wind and extreme temperatures twist them into gnarled, ground-hugging forms. Above the tree line lies the alpine zone proper, a harsh environment where only the most specialized plants can survive. Alpine flora demonstrates remarkable adaptations to extreme conditions, cushion-forming growth habits that create warm microclimates, deep taproots that anchor plants against fierce winds, and 42,000 and intensive flowering strategies that complete reproduction during brief growing seasons. Many alpine plants invest heavily in underground storage organs, maintaining extensive root systems that may comprise 90% of their total biomass. The concept of climate tracking becomes particularly stark in mountain environments because the geometry of peaks limits upslope migration options. As climate zones move upward, species at the highest elevations face a vertical squeeze. Unlike lowland species that can potentially migrate across vast horizontal distances, alpine species encounter the hard boundary of the mountain summit. This elevational limit creates what ecologists term mountaintop extinction, where high elevation specialists disappear locally as their suitable habitat shrinks and ultimately vanishes. Temperature records from mountain weather stations reveal that high elevation environments are warming faster than global averages, a phenomenon similar to Arctic amplification but occurring along vertical gradients. This enhanced warming results partly from reduced snow cover, which decreases surface reflectivity and allows more solar energy absorption. Additionally, the thin atmosphere at high elevations provides less buffering against temperature extremes. Treeline dynamics provide one of the most visible indicators of climate change impacts in mountain ecosystems. Across mountain ranges worldwide, tree lines are advancing upslope as temperatures warm sufficiently to support tree growth at previously unsuitable elevations. In the Rocky Mountains, subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce establish at elevations that were previously too cold for tree survival. Similar patterns occur in the Alps, where Swiss, stone pine, and European larch colonize formerly alpine meadow areas. The rate of tree line advance varies considerably among mountain ranges and depends on factors beyond temperature, including soil development, growing season length, and propagule availability. Trees migrating upslope must not only tolerate new temperature conditions, but also establish in often poorly developed soils and survive extreme weather events that become more frequent with elevation. The process typically begins with scattered individual trees, establishing in sheltered microsites, gradually forming islands of forest that may eventually coalesce. Alpine plant communities face more immediate threats than tree-lined forests because they occupy the highest available habitats. Research across multiple mountain ranges documents upslope migrations of alpine plant species, with many moving several meters higher in elevation per decade. However, the finite nature of mountain peaks means that continued upslope movement eventually leads to habitat loss rather than habitat tracking. The White Mountain avens, an Arctic alpine wildflower, illustrates this elevational squeeze. This species occurs in scattered populations on high peaks throughout northern mountain ranges. In Enquiquefortio, as temperatures warm, suitable habitat contracts towards summit areas, fragmenting populations and reducing total available habitat. Computer models suggest that continued warming could eliminate suitable habitat for this species across much of its current range within decades. Sky islands, isolated mountain ranges separated by valleys or lowlands, create particularly challenging scenarios for climate adaptation. Species populations on different sky islands cannot easily exchange individuals, limiting genetic diversity and reducing adaptive potential. The Chiricahua Mountains of Arizona harbor numerous endemic species that evolved in isolation on this desert sky island. As temperatures rise, these species face the dual challenge of contracting suitable habitat and genetic isolation that limits their evolutionary responses. Endemic species, those found nowhere else on Earth, reach their highest concentrations in mountain environments. The combination of geographic isolation, diverse microhabitats, and evolutionary time has produced extraordinary levels of endemism in many mountain ranges. The Haleakala Silver Sword Alliance in Hawaii includes dozens of species that evolved from a single ancestral colonist, each adapted to specific elevational zones and habitat types. Climate change threatens to compress these zones, potentially driving endemic species extinct before they can adapt or migrate. Mountain streams and lakes experience their own elevation-specific climate impacts. High elevation aquatic systems depend heavily on snowmelt for their water supply, and earlier snowmelt timing affects temperature regimes, flow patterns, and nutrient cycling. Alpine lakes that historically remained ice-covered for most of the year now experience longer ice-free periods, fundamentally altering their thermal structure and biological productivity. The mountain goat populations of North America demonstrate how large mammals respond to changing alpine conditions. These specialized climbers inhabit steep, rocky terrain above treeline, using their exceptional mobility to access sparse vegetation and escape predators. As tree lines advance upslope, mountain goats find their preferred open habitat increasingly fragmented by encroaching forest. Some populations have shifted to higher elevations, but this compression increases competition for limited resources and suitable denning sites. Pollination networks in mountain environments face particular vulnerabilities because both plants and their pollinators must track changing conditions up narrow elevational gradients. Alpine plants often depend on specialized pollinators adapted to high elevation conditions, including bumblebees with enhanced cold tolerance and high altitude butterflies. When plants migrate upslope faster than their pollinators, or when microclimatic changes disrupt synchronized timing, these mutualistic relationships can collapse. The research station networks established on mountains worldwide provide invaluable long-term data sets for tracking elevational range shifts. The Swiss Alps host some of the longest-running alpine research programs, with vegetation monitoring plots established over a century ago. These records document not only species movements, but also changes in plant community composition and productivity across elevational gradients. Microclimate complexity in mountain environments means that simple elevation-based predictions often fail to capture the full picture of species responses to climate change. Topographic features like ridges, valleys, slopes facing different directions, and rock formations create mosaics of microclimates that can provide refugia for climate-sensitive species. North-facing slopes remain cooler than south-facing slopes at the same elevation, potentially allowing cold-adapted species to persist at lower elevations than temperature averages would suggest. Snow dynamics play crucial roles in mountain ecosystem responses to climate change. Many alpine plants depend on consistent snow cover for insulation from winter temperature extremes and for reliable water supply during the growing season. Changes in snowfall timing, accumulation patterns, and melt rates affect these relationships. Earlier snowmelt exposes plants to late-season frosts, while reduced snow cover eliminates the protective insulation that allows survival of extreme cold events. The concept of elevational range shifts differs fundamentally from latitudinal migrations because mountain environments compress large climate gradients into small geographic areas. A species might need to migrate only a few hundred meters upslope to track a temperature change that would require hundreds of kilometers of latitudinal movement in flat terrain. This compression creates both opportunities and constraints for climate adaptation. Mountain ecosystems serve as early warning systems for climate change impacts because temperature changes become amplified with elevation and because species have limited migration options. The losses of high elevation species often precede similar impacts at lower elevations, providing glimpses of potential future changes across broader landscapes. Understanding these mountaintop dynamics becomes essential for predicting how climate change will reshape ecosystems beyond the peaks themselves. The isolation of mountain ranges creates natural experiments in climate adaptation, with similar species on different peaks responding independently to changing conditions. Comparing responses across multiple mountain ranges reveals general patterns while highlighting the importance of local factors in determining species' fates. These comparisons inform conservation strategies and help identify which mountain ecosystems face the greatest risks from continued warming. As we examine these elevational limits and mountaintop extinctions, the broader pattern emerges of climate change, creating winners and losers across landscapes. While some species successfully track their climate envelopes upslope or across continents, others find themselves trapped by geographic constraints or outpaced by the speed of environmental change. This sets the stage for examining how entire biomes respond to these pressures, reshaping the fundamental boundaries between Earth's major ecosystem types. Across Earth's surface, the great biomes form a mosaic of life defined by climate patterns that have remained relatively stable for thousands of years. Tropical rainforests hug the equator, temperate grasslands stretch across continental interiors, and boreal forests ring the northern hemisphere in an unbroken band of conifers. These boundaries between major ecosystem types represent some of the most fundamental organizing principles of life on our planet. Climate change sets these ancient boundaries in motion, creating a global reshuffling of biomes that proceeds at a pace unprecedented in human experience. The transitions between biomes rarely occur as sharp lines across the landscape. Instead, they form gradual ecotones, where characteristics of adjacent biomes intermingle across zones that may span hundreds of kilometers. A journey from prairie to forest typically passes through regions of increasing tree density, where scattered groves gradually merge into continuous woodland. These transition zones harbor unique communities adapted to the mixture of conditions found at biome boundaries. Climate change transforms these ecotones into dynamic frontiers, where the future composition of landscapes plays out in real time. The boundaries themselves become zones of ecological experimentation as species from different biomes encounter new conditions and potential competitors. Some boundaries advance rapidly, while others remain relatively stable or even retreat, depending on the complex interactions between climate, soils, fire regimes, and human activities. The forest grassland boundary across North America illustrates how biome transitions respond to changing climate conditions. This ecotone historically fluctuated with natural climate cycles, advancing eastward during wet periods and retreating westward during droughts. The position of this boundary depends primarily on the balance between precipitation and evaporation, with forests dominating where moisture is sufficient to support tree growth and grasslands prevailing in drier regions. Recent decades have witnessed a general eastward advance of grasslands and a corresponding retreat of forests across portions of the Great Plains. Increased temperatures raise evaporation rates, effectively making existing precipitation less available to plants. Even regions that receive adequate rainfall may experience moisture stress if higher temperatures increase the atmospheric demand for water. This creates a moving zone of forest dieback, followed by grassland establishment. The mechanisms driving forest grassland transitions involve complex feedbacks between vegetation, fire, and climate. Grasslands typically burn more frequently than forests, and these fires can prevent tree establishment even in areas that receive sufficient precipitation to support forest growth. As climate change alters precipitation patterns and increases fire frequency, it can push forest grassland boundaries toward new equilibrium positions that may persist for centuries. Tree mortality events provide dramatic illustrations of biome boundary shifts in action. Across the southwestern United States, extensive areas of pinyon pine and juniper woodland have experienced massive die-offs during severe droughts. These mortality events often leave behind landscapes dominated by shrubs and grasses, effectively converting woodland to more arid ecosystem types. While some areas may eventually recover their tree cover, others appear to have crossed thresholds that prevent forest reestablishment. The boreal forest represents one of Earth's largest biomes, forming a circumpolar band across Canada, Alaska, and northern Eurasia. This vast forest ecosystem faces pressure from both its southern and northern boundaries as climate change proceeds. Southern portions experience increased fire frequency drought stress, and pest outbreaks that can convert forest to grassland or shrubland. Meanwhile, northern boundaries advance into tundra regions as temperatures warm sufficiently to support tree growth. Treeline advance across the Arctic represents one of the most significant biome boundary shifts currently underway. Satellite imagery reveals expanding patches of shrubs and scattered trees advancing into formerly treeless tundra regions. This northern migration of woody plants fundamentally alters Arctic ecosystems by changing surface reflectivity, modifying permafrost conditions, and providing new habitat for forest species while eliminating tundra specialists. The rate of treeline advance varies considerably across the circumpolar Arctic depending on local factors, including soil conditions, seed sources, and microclimatic variations. Some regions show rapid colonization by shrubs and trees, while others remain dominated by tundra vegetation despite warming temperatures. Understanding these differences helps predict which areas face the most rapid ecosystem transitions. Desert boundaries demonstrate how biome shifts can involve multiple ecosystem types simultaneously. The edges of desert regions may advance into grasslands, shrublands, or even forests during periods of increased aridity. Conversely, increased precipitation can allow grasslands to expand into formerly desert areas. These transitions often occur gradually over decades, making them less visible than sudden forest mortality events, but equally significant for ecosystem structure. The Sahel region of Africa provides a well-documented example of desert boundary dynamics. This semi-arid zone between the Sahara Desert and tropical savannas experiences dramatic fluctuations in vegetation cover related to rainfall patterns. Extended droughts can cause desert-like conditions to expand hundreds of kilometers southward, while wet periods allow grasslands and shrublands to reclaim formerly barren areas. Climate change adds new complexity to these natural fluctuations by altering the frequency and intensity of drought cycles. Soil characteristics play crucial roles in determining where biome boundaries stabilize under changing climate conditions. Different vegetation types create distinct soil conditions through their patterns of nutrient cycling, water use, and organic matter inputs. Grassland soils typically contain higher organic matter content than forest soils due to the extensive root systems of grasses and their rapid turnover. These soil differences can persist long after vegetation changes, influencing which plant communities can establish in transitional areas. Fire regimes serve as both drivers and consequences of biome boundary shifts. Different biomes are characterized by distinct fire frequencies and intensities, and these fire patterns help maintain biome boundaries by favoring certain plant communities over others. Grasslands burn frequently but at relatively low intensities, favoring grasses over trees. Forests may burn less frequently but more intensely, creating conditions that can shift forest boundaries rapidly. Climate change alters fire regimes in ways that can accelerate biome transitions. Increased temperatures and altered precipitation patterns affect fuel moisture, fire season length, and ignition frequency. These changes can push fire-adapted ecosystems beyond their historical range of variability, triggering shifts to alternative ecosystem states. The interaction between changing climate and changing fire regimes creates nonlinear responses that can produce rapid, large-scale ecosystem transitions. Mountain regions experience particularly complex biome boundary dynamics because elevation gradients compress multiple biomes into relatively small geographic areas. As climate zones shift upslope, entire sequences of biomes may migrate vertically, with desert shrublands expanding into former grassland elevations, grasslands moving into woodland zones, and woodlands advancing into former forest areas. These elevational shifts can occur more rapidly than latitudinal biome migrations because the climate gradients are steeper. Human land use patterns interact with climate change to influence biome boundary positions. Agricultural activities, urbanization, and land management practices can either facilitate or impede biome transitions. Areas under intensive human management may resist natural biome shifts, while abandoned agricultural lands may undergo rapid transitions to new ecosystem types. Understanding these human climate interactions becomes essential for predicting future landscape patterns. The concept of alternative stable states helps explain why some biome boundaries shift rapidly while others remain relatively stable despite changing climate conditions. Ecosystems may exist in multiple stable configurations under the same environmental conditions, with transitions between states triggered by disturbances or threshold crossings. A grassland might persist under forest favorable climate conditions due to frequent fires, but convert rapidly to forest if fire frequency decreases. Paleological records reveal that biome boundaries have shifted dramatically throughout Earth's history in response to natural climate changes. Ice Age cycles repeatedly reorganized continental vegetation patterns, with tundra advancing far south during glacial periods and forests expanding during interglacials. These historical precedents demonstrate that biome boundaries are inherently dynamic, but current rates of change often exceed those documented in the geological record. The speed of current biome boundary shifts challenges both ecological understanding and conservation planning. Protected areas designed to preserve specific biome types may find their target ecosystems migrating beyond reserve boundaries. Conservation strategies increasingly focus on protecting ecosystem processes and environmental gradients rather than attempting to preserve static vegetation types in fixed locations. Novel ecosystem types may emerge in regions where climate change creates environmental conditions without historical precedent. These areas might support plant and animal communities, unlike any currently existing, challenging traditional biome classification systems. Understanding how these novel ecosystems function and what services they provide becomes increasingly important as climate change proceeds. The study of biome boundary dynamics reveals the interconnected nature of Earth's ecosystems and the cascading effects of climate change across multiple scales of biological organization. Changes at biome boundaries influence regional climate patterns, carbon cycling, water resources, and biodiversity conservation. These large-scale ecosystem transitions set the stage for examining more detailed changes within specific biome types, beginning with the forests that cover much of Earth's terrestrial surface. Forests cover roughly 1/3 of Earth's land surface and serve as the planet's lungs, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while releasing oxygen through photosynthesis. These vast ecosystems also regulate water cycles, moderate local climates, and harbor the majority of terrestrial biodiversity. Yet forests worldwide face unprecedented stress from climate change, experiencing alterations in temperature, precipitation, and disturbance regimes that challenge their capacity to maintain current structure and function. The relationship between forests and climate operates as a complex feedback system. Trees influence local and regional climate through their effects on temperature, humidity, and precipitation patterns. Forest canopies moderate temperature extremes by providing shade during hot periods and insulation during cold spells. Through transpiration, trees release water vapor into the atmosphere, contributing to local humidity and precipitation. This moisture recycling can be particularly important in continental interiors, where forests generate a significant portion of their own rainfall. Climate change disrupts these forest-climate relationships in multiple ways. Rising temperatures increase evapotranspiration rates, effectively increasing the water demands of trees, even when precipitation remains constant. Many forest regions experience shifts in precipitation timing, with more rain falling during winter months when trees cannot utilize it effectively and less moisture available during growing seasons when demand peaks. These changes in water balance create physiological stress that weakens trees and makes them more susceptible to other disturbances. Drought stress represents one of the most immediate threats to forest health under climate change. Trees respond to water limitation by closing their stomata, the leaf pores through which they exchange gases. While this conserves water, it also reduces carbon dioxide uptake and photosynthesis, limiting growth and energy production. Prolonged drought can lead to hydraulic failure, where air bubbles form in water-conducting tissues, blocking water transport from roots to leaves and potentially killing branches or entire trees. The mechanism of drought-induced tree mortality varies among species and environmental conditions. Some trees die rapidly from hydraulic failure during severe droughts, while others succumb gradually to carbon starvation as reduced photosynthesis depletes energy reserves. Many trees weaken under drought stress and then fall victim to pest outbreaks or diseases that they might otherwise resist. These indirect effects of drought often cause more widespread mortality than direct physiological failure. Temperature stress adds another layer of challenge for forest ecosystems. Many tree species evolved within specific temperature ranges, and climate change pushes some forests beyond their thermal tolerance limits. Heat stress can damage photosynthetic machinery, disrupt enzyme function, and increase respiration rates that consume energy faster than photosynthesis can replenish it. Extreme heat events, which are becoming more frequent and intense, can cause rapid mortality even in otherwise healthy trees. The interaction between temperature and moisture stress often proves more damaging than either factor alone. High temperatures increase water demand precisely when drought conditions limit water availability, creating a particularly lethal combination for trees. This explains why some of the most dramatic forest mortality events occur during hot, dry conditions that exceed historical norms for both temperature and precipitation. Changing fire regimes represent perhaps the most visible manifestation of climate change impacts on forests. Warmer temperatures, earlier snowmelt, and extended dry seasons create conditions conducive to larger, more intense wildfires. Many forest ecosystems evolved with periodic fire as a natural disturbance, but climate change pushes fire frequency and intensity beyond the range that many forests can tolerate while maintaining their current composition. Fire behavior itself changes under altered climate conditions. Longer fire seasons mean that fires can grow larger before weather conditions suppress them. Higher temperatures and lower humidity create drier fuels that ignite more easily and burn more intensely. Wind patterns associated with climate change can drive fires across landscapes more rapidly than historical patterns, overwhelming the capacity of fire breaks and other suppression efforts. The ecological effects of altered fire regimes extend far beyond immediate tree mortality. Repeated severe fires can convert forests to grasslands or shrublands by eliminating seed sources and creating conditions unfavorable for tree regeneration. Some forest types that historically experienced low intensity fires now face high intensity burns that sterilize soils and eliminate the biological components necessary for forest recovery. Pest and pathogen outbreaks provide another mechanism through which climate change affects forest dynamics. Many forest insects and diseases are limited by cold winter temperatures that kill overwintering life stages. Warmer winters allow larger populations to survive, leading to more severe outbreaks during the following growing season. Extended warm periods also allow multiple generations per year for some pest species, accelerating population growth and damage potential. The mountain pine beetle epidemic across western North America illustrates how climate change can transform natural pest-host relationships into ecosystem-altering disturbances. Historically, periodic cold snaps limited beetle populations and prevented continuous outbreaks. Warmer winters have eliminated this natural population control, allowing beetles to maintain high densities across vast areas and kill millions of acres of pine forests. These mortality events alter forest composition, fire behavior, and carbon storage across entire mountain ranges. Forest composition changes represent a more gradual but equally significant response to climate stress. As conditions become unsuitable for some species, forests undergo shifts in species dominance that can fundamentally alter ecosystem properties. Shade-tolerant species may give way to more drought-tolerant varieties, while fast-growing pioneer species colonize areas where canopy trees have died. These compositional changes often persist for decades or centuries, representing long-term ecosystem transformations. The concept of forest resilience describes the capacity of forest ecosystems to absorb disturbances while maintaining their essential structure and function. Some forests demonstrate remarkable resilience to climate stresses, recovering rapidly from droughts, fires, or pest outbreaks. Others appear to cross tipping points where they transition to alternative ecosystem states that may persist indefinitely under new climate conditions. Factors that influence forest resilience include species diversity, genetic variation within tree populations, soil properties, and landscape connectivity. Diverse forests often show greater resilience because different species respond differently to environmental stresses, providing ecological insurance against complete system failure. Genetic diversity within species allows populations to adapt to changing conditions through natural selection, while landscape connectivity facilitates recolonization after disturbances. Carbon cycling in forests changes dramatically under climate stress, with implications for global climate regulation. Healthy forests typically sequester carbon by storing it in wood, roots, and soil organic matter. Stressed forests may become carbon sources rather than sinks, releasing stored carbon through increased tree mortality, decomposition, and fire emissions. This creates a positive feedback loop where forest degradation contributes additional greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, accelerating climate change. The timing and magnitude of carbon release from stressed forests depend on the type and severity of disturbances. Fires release carbon immediately through combustion, while insect-killed trees release carbon more gradually as dead wood decays. Some disturbances, like low-intensity fires that thin forest stands without killing canopy trees, may actually enhance carbon sequestration by reducing competition and stimulating growth in surviving trees. Forest management strategies increasingly focus on building resilience to climate change rather than attempting to maintain historical forest conditions. Adaptive management approaches include reducing forest density to decrease competition for water, promoting species diversity to increase ecosystem stability, and conducting prescribed burns to reduce fuel loads and restore natural fire cycles. These strategies recognize that forests must change to survive under altered climate conditions. Assisted migration represents a more interventionist approach to forest adaptation, involving the deliberate movement of tree species or populations to areas where they are more likely to survive under future climate conditions. This controversial practice challenges traditional conservation approaches that emphasize preserving native species in their historical locations. However, the speed of climate change may exceed the natural migration rates of many tree species, making human assistance necessary for their survival. The study of forest responses to past climate changes provides insights into potential future scenarios. Paleoecological records show that forests have undergone dramatic reorganizations during previous climate transitions, with species compositions and distributions changing substantially over relatively short time periods. These historical precedents suggest that current forest changes represent natural responses to environmental shifts, though the speed and magnitude of current changes often exceed historical rates. Forest fragmentation complicates responses to climate stress by isolating populations and limiting their capacity to track suitable climate conditions. Small forest patches may lack the genetic diversity necessary for adaptation, while edge effects can expose interior forest species to unsuitable microclimatic conditions. Maintaining large, connected forest landscapes becomes increasingly important for supporting forest adaptation to climate change. The economic and social implications of forest changes under climate stress extend far beyond ecological considerations. Forest dependent communities face threats to their livelihoods as traditional forest products become less available. Water supplies that depend on forest watersheds may become less reliable as forest cover changes. Recreation and tourism industries built around forest landscapes must adapt to altered scenery and reduced amenities. Understanding forest dynamics under climate stress reveals the interconnected nature of environmental change and the cascading effects that extend throughout Earth's systems. Changes in forest structure and function influence water cycles, which in turn affect aquatic ecosystems downstream. This connection between terrestrial and aquatic systems becomes our next focus as we examine how climate change transforms lakes, rivers, and wetlands. Water connects all ecosystems on Earth, flowing from mountains to valleys, linking terrestrial and marine environments through an endless cycle of evaporation, precipitation, and runoff. Lakes, rivers, streams, and wetlands serve as the arteries of the landscape, supporting unique communities of life while providing essential services to both natural systems and human societies. Climate change transforms these aquatic ecosystems through alterations in temperature, hydrology, and chemistry that cascade through food webs and reshape the fundamental character of freshwater environments. The thermal properties of water create unique responses to climate change in aquatic systems. Water has a high heat capacity, meaning it absorbs and releases large amounts of energy with relatively small temperature changes. This thermal inertia buffers aquatic organisms from rapid temperature fluctuations, but also means that once water bodies warm, they retain heat for extended periods. Lake and stream temperatures now trend steadily upward across most of the globe, with some water bodies warming faster than air temperatures due to reduced ice cover and altered mixing patterns. Thermal stratification in lakes demonstrates how warming affects the three-dimensional structure of aquatic ecosystems. During summer months, many lakes develop distinct temperature layers, with warm water floating on top of cooler, denser water below. This stratification prevents mixing between surface and deep waters, creating different chemical and biological environments at various depths. Climate change strengthens this stratification by warming surface waters more than deep waters, reducing the exchange of oxygen and nutrients between layers. The consequences of enhanced thermal stratification extend throughout lake ecosystems. Surface waters may become oxygen depleted as decomposition consumes available oxygen faster than it can be replenished from the atmosphere. Deep waters may become anoxic, creating dead zones where most aquatic life cannot survive. The boundary between oxygenated and oxygen depleted waters, called the thermocline, becomes a critical ecological barrier that many species cannot cross. Ice phenology provides one of the most dramatic indicators of climate change impacts on freshwater systems. Lakes and rivers across northern regions now freeze later in autumn and thaw earlier in spring, reducing ice-covered periods by weeks or even months compared to historical patterns. This shortened ice season affects every aspect of aquatic ecosystem function, from light penetration and gas exchange to the life cycles of ice-adapted organisms. Under-ice ecosystems represent unique environments that exist only during winter months in ice-covered water bodies. These communities include specialized algae, bacteria, and invertebrates adapted to low light, cold conditions beneath the ice. Fish species like lake trout and cisco depend on cold, well-oxygenated waters that develop under ice cover. As ice-free periods lengthen, these under-ice communities face habitat loss, while ice-dependent species experience range contractions and population declines. Hydrological changes accompanying climate change alter the fundamental flow patterns that structure aquatic ecosystems. Many regions experience shifts in precipitation timing, with more rain falling during winter months and less during summer growing seasons. This creates seasonal mismatches between water availability and biological activity. Spring snowmelt, historically the dominant source of water for many rivers and lakes, now occurs earlier and more rapidly, creating flood conditions followed by extended low flow periods. Stream ecosystems evolved around predictable flow regimes that provide different habitats during high and low water periods. Many aquatic insects time their life cycles to coincide with specific flow conditions, emerging as adults during predictable seasonal patterns. Altered hydrology disrupts these relationships, leaving some species stranded in unsuitable habitat while eliminating the flow conditions that others require for reproduction or feeding. The concept of environmental flows describes the water regimes necessary to maintain aquatic ecosystem health and function. Climate change challenges the ability of both natural and managed water systems to provide these essential flows. Rivers regulated by dams face particular difficulties because reservoir operations designed around historical climate patterns may no longer provide appropriate flow regimes for downstream ecosystems. Water chemistry changes represent another pathway through which climate change affects aquatic systems. Warmer temperatures accelerate chemical and biological processes, altering the rates of nutrient cycling, decomposition, and primary productivity. Increased rainfall intensity can cause more frequent and severe runoff events that carry elevated loads of sediments, nutrients, and pollutants into water bodies. Eutrophication, the enrichment of waters with nutrients that stimulate excessive plant and algae growth, intensifies under warming conditions. Higher temperatures increase the growth rates of algae and aquatic plants, while enhanced stratification traps nutrients in surface waters where they fuel additional growth. Algal blooms become more frequent, larger, and longer lasting, sometimes producing toxins that make water unsafe for human use and deadly for aquatic life. The timing of biological events in aquatic ecosystems shifts in response to changing temperature and hydrological patterns. Phytoplankton blooms now begin earlier in spring across many lake systems, disrupting the synchronized timing between primary producers and their consumers. Zooplankton, that depend on specific algae species for food, may miss peak abundance periods, creating mismatches that propagate up through aquatic food webs. Fish spawning provides particularly clear examples of phenological shifts in aquatic systems. Many fish species spawn when water temperatures reach specific thresholds, and these spawning events now occur weeks earlier than historical averages in many water bodies. Early spawning can expose eggs and larvae to temperature fluctuations or predation pressures they did not historically encounter, affecting recruitment success and population dynamics. Cold-water fish species face particular challenges from warming aquatic environments. Trout, salmon, and other cold-water species require specific temperature ranges for survival and reproduction. As water temperatures rise, suitable habitat contracts to higher elevations, northern latitudes, or deeper waters. Some populations become isolated in thermal refugia, small areas that remain cool enough to support cold water species, while others face local extinction as their habitat disappears entirely. The distribution of aquatic species shifts in response to changing thermal conditions, creating novel community assemblages as warm water species expand their ranges into previously cold water habitats. Smallmouth bass now inhabit northern lakes where they were historically absent, competing with native cold water species for food and habitat. These range expansions can dramatically alter predation patterns and ecosystem structure in receiving waters. Wetland ecosystems experience particularly complex responses to climate change because they exist at the intersection of terrestrial and aquatic environments. Wetland hydrology depends on the balance between precipitation, evaporation, and groundwater inputs, all of which change under altered climate conditions. Some wetlands may dry out completely during extended droughts, while others may become permanently flooded as precipitation patterns shift. Prairie pothole wetlands across central North America demonstrate the vulnerability of these transitional ecosystems to climate change. These shallow wetlands support millions of waterfowl during breeding season and provide crucial habitat for numerous other species. Increased temperatures and altered precipitation patterns threaten to eliminate many of these wetlands, particularly smaller ones that dry out during drought periods. The plants and animals that inhabit wetlands show diverse responses to changing hydrological conditions. Some wetland plants require specific water level fluctuations to complete their life cycles, with seeds germinating during dry periods and growing during subsequent flooding. Climate change disrupts these natural water level cycles, favoring species that can tolerate a wider range of conditions while eliminating specialists adapted to particular hydroperiods. Aquatic invasive species often benefit from climate-driven changes in freshwater ecosystems. Warmer temperatures may allow non-native species to survive in areas where they were previously limited by cold conditions. Altered flow regimes can create disturbances that invasive species exploit more effectively than native species. The zebra mussel invasion of North American waters accelerated partly due to warmer water temperatures that enhance their reproduction and survival rates. Groundwater systems, though less visible than surface waters, also respond to climate change through altered recharge patterns and increased extraction demands. Many aquatic ecosystems depend on groundwater inputs to maintain base flows during dry periods. Changes in groundwater levels can affect the hydrology of streams, lakes, and wetlands, particularly during drought conditions when surface water sources become limited. The chemical composition of precipitation changes under climate change, affecting the chemistry of receiving waters. Altered atmospheric circulation patterns can transport different types and concentrations of pollutants to aquatic systems. Increased storm intensity can mobilize contaminants from terrestrial sources, delivering pulses of nutrients, sediments, and toxins that stress aquatic communities. Riparian vegetation, the plants that grow along water bodies, plays crucial roles in maintaining aquatic ecosystem health through shade provision, bank stabilization, and nutrient filtering. Climate change affects riparian plant communities through drought stress, altered flood regimes, and shifts in species composition. Changes in riparian vegetation alter the amount of organic matter entering aquatic systems and modify the thermal regime of streams and rivers. The management of aquatic ecosystems under climate change requires adaptive approaches that recognize the dynamic nature of these systems. Traditional management strategies based on historical conditions may prove inadequate as climate continues to change. Managers increasingly focus on maintaining ecosystem resilience and facilitating adaptation rather than attempting to preserve historical conditions. Understanding how freshwater systems respond to climate change provides essential context for examining the even more dramatic transformations occurring in marine environments. The vast oceans that cover most of Earth's surface face their own suite of climate-driven changes that dwarf the alterations affecting inland waters in both scale and complexity. The oceans cover more than 70% of Earth's surface and contain 97% of the planet's water, forming a vast interconnected system that regulates global climate and supports the majority of life on Earth. These immense bodies of salt water absorb heat, transport nutrients across continents, and drive weather patterns that influence every terrestrial ecosystem. Climate change transforms the oceans through multiple pathways simultaneously: rising temperatures, altered chemistry from absorbed carbon dioxide, and reorganized circulation patterns that redistribute heat and nutrients across the globe. Ocean warming represents the most direct manifestation of climate change in marine environments. The oceans have absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat trapped by greenhouse gases, buffering the atmosphere from even more dramatic temperature increases. This thermal absorption occurs unevenly across ocean basins and depths, creating complex patterns of warming that reshape marine ecosystems from surface waters to the abyssal depths. Surface ocean temperatures have risen by approximately 1 degree Celsius since the mid-20th century, with some regions experiencing much larger increases. The Arctic Ocean shows particularly dramatic warming, with some areas experiencing temperature increases of several degrees. This polar amplification of ocean warming contributes to accelerated sea ice loss and alterations in Arctic marine ecosystems that depend on ice covered conditions. The thermal expansion of seawater as it warms contributes significantly to global sea level rise, accounting for roughly half of the observed increase in ocean levels. As water molecules gain energy from heat, they move more rapidly and occupy more space, causing the entire volume of the ocean to expand. This thermal expansion occurs gradually but persistently, representing a long-term commitment to rising seas even if greenhouse gas emissions were to stop immediately. Ocean acidification represents an entirely separate dimension of climate change impacts on marine systems, often called the other CO2 problem. As atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations increase, the oceans absorb approximately 25% of human generated CO2 emissions. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it forms carbonic acid, lowering the pH of ocean water and making it more acidic. The chemistry of ocean acidification affects marine life through multiple mechanisms. Lower pH reduces the availability of carbonate ions that many organisms use to build shells, skeletons, and other calcium carbonate structures. Corals, mollusks, sea urchins, and numerous types of plankton face increased difficulty constructing and maintaining their protective structures. Some species may dissolve existing shells or skeletons if acidification becomes severe enough. Ocean pH has already declined by 0.1 units since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, representing a 30% increase in acidity. While this change might seem small, the logarithmic nature of the pH scale means that relatively small numerical changes represent substantial alterations in ocean chemistry. Projections suggest that continued carbon dioxide emissions could double ocean acidity by the end of this century. The impacts of ocean acidification extend beyond calcifying organisms to affect the broader marine food web. Many marine organisms show altered behavior under more acidic conditions, including changes in predator avoidance, navigation, and reproduction. Fish larvae exposed to acidified water may lose their ability to detect predators or locate suitable habitat, reducing their survival rates and affecting recruitment to adult populations. Ocean circulation patterns transport heat, nutrients, and oxygen across global distances, creating the physical foundation for marine ecosystem productivity. Climate change alters these circulation systems through changes in temperature gradients, wind patterns, and freshwater inputs from melting ice and altered precipitation. These modifications to ocean circulation can shift the location and intensity of upwelling zones, alter the delivery of nutrients to surface waters, and change the transport of marine larvae and adults. The thermohaline circulation, often called the global conveyor belt, represents one of the most important ocean circulation systems affected by climate change. This deep water circulation pattern transports warm surface water toward the poles, where it cools, becomes denser, and sinks to form deep water masses that flow back toward the equator. Climate change weakens this circulation through surface warming and freshwater inputs from melting ice that reduce the density differences driving the circulation. Upwelling systems along coastal margins provide some of the most productive marine ecosystems on Earth by bringing nutrient-rich deep water to the surface, where it fuels primary productivity. Climate change affects upwelling through alterations in wind patterns and ocean temperature structure. Some upwelling regions may intensify as temperature gradients strengthen, while others may weaken or shift location as circulation patterns reorganize. The stratification of ocean waters intensifies under climate change as surface waters warm faster than deeper layers. This enhanced stratification reduces the mixing between surface and deep waters, limiting the transport of nutrients from depth to the sunlit surface zone where most marine photosynthesis occurs. Reduced nutrient supply can decrease primary productivity in many ocean regions, affecting the entire marine food web. Oxygen levels in ocean waters decline under climate change through multiple mechanisms. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen than cooler water, directly reducing oxygen availability for marine life. Enhanced stratification also reduces the transport of oxygen from surface waters to depth, while increased decomposition rates in warmer water consume oxygen faster than it can be replenished. These processes create expanding oxygen minimum zones where marine life cannot survive. Marine heat waves represent extreme events that are becoming more frequent and intense as ocean temperatures rise. These prolonged periods of unusually warm water can stress marine organisms beyond their tolerance limits, causing mass mortality events and ecosystem disruptions. The marine heat wave that affected the North Pacific from 2014 to 2016, dubbed the Blob, caused widespread seabird die-offs, algal blooms, and fisheries collapses across the region. Sea ice systems in both polar regions face dramatic changes that affect marine ecosystems dependent on ice-associated habitat. Arctic sea ice extent has declined by more than 10% per decade since satellite monitoring began, with particularly rapid losses during summer months. Antarctic sea ice shows more complex patterns, with some regions losing ice while others gain it, but overall trends indicate declining ice extent. The loss of sea ice affects marine ecosystems through multiple pathways. Ice-associated algae that grow on the underside of sea ice provide food for krill and other small organisms that form the base of polar marine food webs. Seals, polar bears, and other marine mammals depend on sea ice for breeding, resting, and hunting platforms. As ice disappears, these species face habitat loss and must adapt to new foraging strategies or face population declines. Changes in sea ice also affect ocean circulation and climate through feedback mechanisms. Ice-covered surfaces reflect most incoming solar radiation back to space, while dark ocean water absorbs most solar energy. As ice melts and exposes more ocean surface, additional solar heating accelerates further ice loss and ocean warming. This ice albedo feedback represents one of the strongest positive feedback loops in the climate system. The seasonal timing of sea ice formation and breakup affects the life cycles of many polar marine species. Earlier ice breakup can disrupt breeding cycles, while later ice formation reduces the duration of ice-associated habitat. These phenological changes in ice conditions create mismatches between species' life history requirements and available habitat. Ocean chemistry changes extend beyond acidification to include alterations in nutrient cycling, oxygen distribution, and trace element availability. Warmer temperatures accelerate biological and chemical processes, altering the rates at which nutrients cycle through marine food webs. Changes in circulation patterns redistribute nutrients spatially, creating winners and losers among different ocean regions and marine communities. The carbonic chemistry changes associated with ocean acidification affect not only shell building organisms, but also the broader carbon cycle in marine systems. Reduced calcification by marine organisms means less carbon is removed from surface waters through shell formation, potentially altering the ocean's capacity to absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide. These feedback effects could accelerate atmospheric carbon dioxide accumulation. Deep ocean environments, long considered stable and isolated from surface changes, increasingly show impacts from climate change. Deep waters warm slowly but persistently, while changes in surface conditions alter the properties of water masses that sink to form deep water. Reduced oxygen levels, altered temperature gradients, and changed chemical composition affect deep sea communities adapted to stable environmental conditions. The impacts of multiple climate stressors often combine to create more severe effects than any single stressor alone. Marine organisms simultaneously face warming temperatures, acidifying water, declining oxygen levels, and altered food availability. These multiple stressors can interact synergistically, with combined effects exceeding the sum of individual impacts. Understanding these interactions becomes crucial for predicting ecosystem responses and developing management strategies. Regional variations in ocean climate change create a complex mosaic of impacts across different marine systems. Some regions experience rapid warming, while others show more modest changes. Upwelling areas may intensify in some locations, while weakening in others. These spatial patterns of change create a shifting geography of marine productivity and species distributions that challenges both natural adaptation and human management efforts. The pace of ocean changes varies dramatically across different components of the marine system. Surface temperatures respond relatively quickly to atmospheric changes, while deep ocean temperatures change over decades to centuries. Chemical changes like acidification proceed at intermediate rates, while biological responses span timescales from immediate behavioral changes to evolutionary adaptations over many generations. Understanding these fundamental physical and chemical transformations of ocean systems provides the foundation for examining their biological consequences. The changes in temperature, chemistry, and circulation that we have explored create new selective pressures and environmental conditions that force marine communities to reorganize in ways both predictable and surprising. The vast oceans that cover most of Earth's surface support food webs of staggering complexity, linking microscopic plankton to massive whales through intricate networks of feeding relationships that span multiple trophic levels. These marine food webs evolved over millions of years within relatively stable oceanic conditions, creating finely tuned relationships between predators and prey, primary producers and consumers. Climate change disrupts these ancient connections, forcing marine communities to reorganize as species respond differently to warming waters, changing chemistry, and altered circulation patterns. At the foundation of marine food webs lie the phytoplankton, microscopic algae that drift in surface waters and convert sunlight into organic matter through photosynthesis. These tiny organisms may be individually invisible, but collectively they produce roughly half of the oxygen we breathe and support virtually all marine life. Climate change affects phytoplankton communities through temperature changes, altered nutrient availability, and shifts in ocean circulation that determine where and when these primary producers can thrive. Different phytoplankton species respond distinctly to warming ocean temperatures, creating shifts in community composition that ripple through entire food webs. Smaller species often dominate warmer waters, while larger diatoms that form the base of many productive food chains require cooler conditions and higher nutrient levels. As ocean temperatures rise, phytoplankton communities shift towards smaller species that provide less nutritional value per unit volume, potentially reducing the efficiency of energy transfer to higher trophic levels. The timing of phytoplankton blooms has advanced across many ocean regions, disrupting the synchronized relationships between primary producers and their consumers. Spring blooms that historically coincided with the reproduction cycles of zooplankton and fish now occur weeks earlier in some areas, creating temporal mismatches that affect the survival of larvae and juveniles. These phenological shifts can cascade through food webs, affecting the abundance and distribution of species at multiple trophic levels. Zooplankton, the small animals that feed on phytoplankton and form a crucial link between primary producers and larger marine animals, demonstrate remarkable sensitivity to temperature changes. Many zooplankton species have narrow thermal tolerance ranges, and even modest warming can push them beyond their physiological limits or force them to migrate to cooler waters. The copepod Calanus finmarchicus, a keystone species in North Atlantic food webs, has shifted its distribution hundreds of kilometers northward as waters warm, affecting the entire ecosystem that depends on its seasonal abundance. The geographic redistribution of zooplankton communities creates cascading effects throughout marine food webs. Fish, seabirds, and marine mammals that depend on specific zooplankton species for food must either follow their prey to new locations, switch to alternative food sources, or face population declines. The northern right whale, one of the world's most endangered large whales, faces increased threats as its primary food source, copepods in the genus Calanus, shifts northward into areas with heavy shipping traffic. Fish communities across the world's oceans show dramatic responses to climate change, with many species shifting their distributions poleward as they track suitable temperature conditions. These range shifts often occur faster than the migration of their traditional prey species, forcing fish to adapt their diets or compete with new species for available food resources. The reorganization of fish communities affects both commercial fisheries and the broader ecosystem dynamics that depend on fish as both predators and prey. Commercially important fish species demonstrate some of the most economically significant responses to changing ocean conditions. Atlantic cod stocks in the North Sea have shifted dramatically northward, with southern populations collapsing while northern stocks remain stable or even increase. Similar patterns occur with Pacific salmon, whose populations face challenges from warming rivers and changing ocean conditions that affect their complex life cycles, spanning both freshwater and marine environments. The vertical structure of marine food webs also responds to climate change as species adjust their depth distributions to track suitable temperature and oxygen conditions. Some fish species move to deeper, cooler waters as surface temperatures rise, but this strategy has limits because deeper waters often contain less oxygen and fewer food resources. These vertical migrations can compress species into narrower depth ranges, intensifying competition and predation pressure. Marine predators at the top of food webs face particular challenges from climate-driven changes because they depend on the cumulative effects of changes throughout the entire food web. Seabirds that nest on coastal islands must travel increasingly long distances to find adequate food as fish populations shift or decline. Many seabird colonies have experienced dramatic population declines or complete breeding failures when climate change disrupts the marine food webs they depend upon. The common Murray populations of the North Pacific illustrate how climate change affects seabird reproduction and survival. These diving birds feed primarily on small schooling fish like sardines and anchovies. Marine heat waves and altered ocean circulation patterns have shifted the distribution and abundance of these fish, forcing murres to travel farther from their nesting colonies to find food. Extended foraging trips reduce the frequency of chick feeding, leading to poor breeding success and population declines. Marine mammals face similar challenges as their prey species respond to changing ocean conditions. Polar bears depend on sea ice platforms for hunting seals, but declining ice coverage forces them to travel longer distances between hunting areas or switch to less nutritious terrestrial food sources. The loss of sea ice habitat represents one of the most visible examples of climate change impacts on marine food webs, affecting species from ice algae to apex predators. Deep sea food webs, long considered isolated from surface changes, increasingly show impacts from climate driven alterations in the supply of organic matter from surface waters. The marine snow of dead plankton, fecal pellets, and other organic particles that sinks from surface waters provides the primary energy source for most deep sea communities. Changes in surface productivity and species composition alter both the quantity and quality of this food supply, affecting deep sea ecosystems thousands of meters below the surface. Coral reef ecosystems represent some of the most diverse and productive marine communities, but they face severe threats from multiple climate change impacts. Rising ocean temperatures cause coral bleaching events that can kill entire reef systems, while ocean acidification makes it more difficult for corals to build and maintain their calcium carbonate skeletons. The loss of coral habitat eliminates the complex three-dimensional structure that supports countless fish and invertebrate species, causing entire reef food webs to collapse. The relationship between corals and their symbiotic algae, called zooxanthellae, forms the foundation of coral reef productivity. These algae live within coral tissues and provide energy through photosynthesis in exchange for protection and nutrients. Rising temperatures stress this relationship, causing corals to expel their algae in bleaching events that can lead to coral death if conditions do not improve quickly. Back-to-back bleaching events increasingly prevent coral recovery, leading to long-term shifts from coral-dominated to algae-dominated reef systems. Invasive species often benefit from climate-driven disruptions to marine food webs, exploiting the ecological opportunities created when native species decline or ecosystems become destabilized. Warmer waters allow tropical species to establish populations in previously temperate regions, while altered current patterns transport invasive species to new areas. The lionfish invasion of the western Atlantic demonstrates how invasive species can rapidly reorganize marine food webs when they encounter naive prey species and lack natural predators. Ocean acidification affects marine food webs through both direct impacts on calcifying organisms and indirect effects on species interactions. Shell-building organisms like pteropods, small swimming snails that form an important food source for fish and marine mammals, face difficulties constructing and maintaining their shells in more acidic waters. The decline of these organisms reduces food availability for their predators and alters the vertical transport of carbon as fewer calcium carbonate shells sink to deep waters. The cumulative effects of multiple climate stressors often exceed the impacts of any single factor alone. Marine organisms simultaneously face warming temperatures, acidifying waters, declining oxygen levels, and altered food webs. These multiple stressors can interact synergistically with combined effects that are greater than the sum of individual impacts. Coral reefs, for example, face bleaching from heat stress, reduced calcification from acidification, and increased storm damage from more intense hurricanes. Tipping points in marine food webs occur when gradual changes suddenly trigger rapid, large scale reorganizations of ecosystem structure and function. The collapse of sardine populations off the California coast during warm El Nino events demonstrates how marine ecosystems can shift rapidly between alternative states. These ecosystem level changes can persist for years or decades, representing fundamental alterations rather than temporary fluctuations. Marine protected areas and other conservation strategies increasingly recognize the need to account for climate driven changes in species distributions and ecosystem dynamics. Traditional approaches that focus on protecting fixed locations may become less effective as species migrate and ecosystems reorganize. Dynamic management strategies that can adapt to changing conditions offer more promise for maintaining marine biodiversity and ecosystem function. The study of marine food web responses to past climate changes provides insights into potential future scenarios. Paleological records from sediment cores reveal how marine ecosystems reorganized during previous warm periods, offering examples of the types of changes that might occur under continued warming. These historical precedents suggest that marine food webs have considerable capacity for reorganization, but also highlight the potential for dramatic ecosystem shifts. Understanding how climate change disrupts marine food webs reveals the interconnected nature of ocean ecosystems and the cascading effects that can result from changes at any trophic level. These marine transformations parallel similar disruptions occurring in terrestrial food webs, where climate change creates equally complex reorganizations of predator prey relationships and community structure on land. On land, food webs weave together the fates of countless species through intricate networks of predation, herbivory, and decomposition that have evolved over millions of years. From the smallest soil, microorganisms, to the largest mammalian predators, terrestrial communities depend on precisely timed interactions and finely balanced relationships that climate change now disrupts across multiple scales. As temperatures rise, precipitation patterns shift, and growing seasons extend or contract, the fundamental connections that bind terrestrial ecosystems together face unprecedented stress. Plant communities form the foundation of terrestrial food webs, converting solar energy into the organic matter that supports all other life on land. Climate change affects primary productivity through multiple pathways: altered temperature regimes that influence photosynthetic rates, changed precipitation patterns that determine water availability, and shifting atmospheric composition that modifies plant growth responses. These changes in plant productivity and species composition cascade through food webs, affecting every organism that depends directly or indirectly on plant matter for survival. The timing of plant growth phases creates temporal templates around which entire terrestrial communities organize their activities. Spring leaf out signals the beginning of the growing season, triggering the emergence of herbivorous insects, the arrival of migratory birds, and the awakening of animals from winter dormancy. Climate change advances many of these plant phenological events, but different species respond at different rates, creating temporal mismatches that disrupt co-evolved relationships throughout terrestrial food webs. Herbivorous insects demonstrate particularly dramatic responses to climate-driven changes in plant phenology because their life cycles often synchronize tightly with specific plant growth phases. Many caterpillars time their emergence to coincide with the tender new leaves of spring, when plant tissues contain optimal nutrition and minimal chemical defenses. As trees leaf out earlier in response to warming temperatures, but insect emergence cues may lag behind. Caterpillars may hatch to find leaves already too mature and chemically defended to provide adequate nutrition. The European winter moth illustrates how phenological mismatches propagate through terrestrial food webs. This species times its larval emergence to coincide with oak bud burst, but warming temperatures have advanced bud burst faster than moth emergence. Caterpillars now often emerge after peak leaf quality has passed, leading to reduced survival and population declines. These population changes affect the birds that depend on winter moth caterpillars to feed their chicks, creating cascading effects through multiple trophic levels. Forest food webs face particularly complex disruptions because trees create the three-dimensional habitat structure that supports diverse communities of plants, animals, and microorganisms. Climate-driven changes in tree species composition alter the types of food resources available to forest communities, as drought-tolerant tree species replace more mesic species. The insects, birds, and mammals adapted to specific tree types must either adapt to new food sources or track their preferred host plants to new locations. The relationship between oak trees and the insects that feed on them demonstrates how climate change affects plant-herbivore interactions. Oak trees support hundreds of insect species, many of which specialize on particular oak species or even specific plant parts. As climate change shifts oak distributions and alters their growth patterns, these specialized insects face challenges in tracking their host plants or adapting to new oak species with different chemical defenses and nutritional profiles. Predatory insects and spiders that control herbivore populations show varied responses to climate change that can disrupt natural pest control services in terrestrial ecosystems. Some predator populations increase with warmer temperatures and longer growing seasons, potentially enhancing their control of herbivore pests. However, if predator and prey species respond differently to climate cues, temporal mismatches can reduce predation efficiency and allow herbivore outbreaks that damage plant communities. Bird communities experience cascading effects from climate-driven changes in insect abundance and phenology. Insectivorous birds that time their breeding cycles to coincide with peak insect availability may find their food sources have already peaked before their chicks hatch. Great tits in European forests show plastic responses to advancing insect phenology, adjusting their egg-laying dates to better match caterpillar abundance. However, the speed of phenological change may exceed the adaptive capacity of some bird populations. Migratory birds face additional challenges because they must coordinate their arrival at breeding grounds with peak food availability. Long-distance migrants that rely on environmental cues at their wintering grounds to time migration may arrive at breeding areas after optimal conditions have passed. This temporal mismatch between migration timing and resource availability can reduce breeding success and contribute to population declines in many migratory species. Mammalian herbivores encounter changing plant communities that affect both food quality and availability. Large herbivores like deer and elk may benefit from longer growing seasons that extend the period of high-quality forage availability. However, these same species may face increased heat stress during summer months and altered snow conditions that affect winter foraging. The balance between these positive and negative effects varies among species and geographic regions. Small mammal populations often respond rapidly to climate-driven changes in vegetation because their short generation times allow quick demographic responses to environmental shifts. Rodent populations may increase in areas where plant productivity rises due to enhanced growing conditions, but decline in regions where drought stress reduces food availability. These fluctuations in small mammal abundance affect the predators that depend on them, creating bottom-up effects that influence carnivore populations. Pollination networks represent some of the most vulnerable components of terrestrial food webs because they depend on precise timing between flowering plants and their pollinator visitors. Climate change advances flowering times for many plant species, but pollinators may not shift their activity periods correspondingly. Native bees that emerge based on temperature cues may find that their preferred flowers bloomed weeks earlier, while flowers that bloom later in the season may lack adequate pollinators. The consequences of pollination network disruption extend beyond immediate reproductive effects to influence plant community composition and ecosystem function. Plants that lose their traditional pollinators may experience reduced seed set, leading to population declines and altered competitive relationships with other plant species. Some plants may shift toward wind pollination or self-fertilization, potentially reducing genetic diversity and adaptive capacity. Decomposer communities and soil ecosystems respond to climate change through altered temperature and moisture regimes that affect decomposition rates and nutrient cycling. Warmer temperatures generally accelerate decomposition, potentially increasing nutrient availability for plants. However, if warming is accompanied by reduced precipitation, soil communities may face moisture stress that limits their activity and alters the efficiency of nutrient cycling processes. Soil food webs include complex networks of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, arthropods, and other organisms that process organic matter and make nutrients available to plants. Climate change affects these communities through direct temperature and moisture effects, but also through changes in the quality and quantity of organic matter inputs from altered plant communities. These below-ground changes can have profound effects on plant productivity and terrestrial ecosystem function. Fire regimes interact with climate change to create additional disruptions in terrestrial food webs. Altered fire frequency and intensity can rapidly restructure plant communities, eliminating some species while favoring others adapted to post-fire conditions. Animals must either flee fire-affected areas or adapt to dramatically altered habitat conditions. Some species benefit from post-fire environments, while others may face local extinction if fire intervals become too short for population recovery. Predator-prey relationships face disruption when climate change affects the abundance, distribution, or behavior of either predators or their prey. Lynx and snowshoe hare cycles in boreal forests may be altered by changing snow conditions that affect hare vulnerability to predation. Similarly, wolf pack success may change if altered winter conditions affect the hunting efficiency or prey vulnerability during critical winter months. Range shifts create novel species interactions as climate change brings together species that previously had little or no contact. These new interactions can disrupt established food web relationships and create unpredictable consequences for community structure. When southern species expand northward, they may encounter prey species that lack evolved defenses against the new predators, potentially leading to dramatic population impacts. Edge effects become more important as climate change fragments habitats and creates more boundary areas between different ecosystem types. Species adapted to forest interior conditions may find themselves exposed to edge effects as forest boundaries shift. These edge environments often support different predator and prey communities than forest interiors, altering the ecological relationships that forest species evolved to exploit. The cumulative effects of multiple climate stressors often exceed the sum of individual impacts on terrestrial food webs. Plants and animals simultaneously face changing temperatures, altered precipitation, shifted growing seasons, and modified disturbance regimes. These multiple stressors can interact synergistically to create ecosystem changes that are difficult to predict from single factor studies. Understanding terrestrial food web disruptions reveals the interconnected nature of land based ecosystems and the potential for widespread ecological reorganization under continued climate change. These disruptions in terrestrial communities parallel changes occurring in disease ecology, where shifting climate conditions create new opportunities for pathogens and parasites to exploit stressed ecosystems and vulnerable host populations. The invisible world of pathogens and parasites shapes ecological communities through complex webs of infection that rival food webs in their intricacy and importance. Every organism on Earth harbors multiple species of microbes, viruses, and parasites, creating a hidden layer of biodiversity that influences population dynamics, community structure, and evolutionary processes. Climate change transforms these disease relationships by altering the geographic ranges of pathogens and their vectors, changing the physiological stress levels of potential hosts, and creating novel pathogen host encounters that can trigger devastating outbreaks across previously unexposed populations. Temperature serves as a master regulator of infectious disease dynamics because it controls the development rates, survival, and reproduction of pathogens, parasites, and the vectors that transmit them. Most disease-causing organisms are ectothermic, meaning their metabolic rates increase with temperature up to thermal tolerance limits. Warmer conditions typically accelerate pathogen reproduction, shorten generation times, and increase transmission rates, creating the potential for more intense and rapid disease outbreaks in warming ecosystems. Vector-borne diseases demonstrate particularly clear responses to climate change because they depend on arthropod vectors like mosquitoes, ticks, and flies that are highly temperature sensitive. These vectors must complete complex life cycles that include egg development, larval growth, pupation, and adult reproduction, all of which proceed faster at higher temperatures. The extrinsic incubation period, the time required for pathogens to develop within vectors to become transmissible, also decreases with warming, allowing infected vectors to begin transmitting diseases sooner after acquiring them. Mosquito-borne diseases provide textbook examples of climate-driven range expansions in disease ecology. Malaria, dengue fever, chikungunya, and Zika virus all depend on mosquito vectors that are expanding their distributions poleward and to higher elevations as temperatures warm. The Aedes aegypti mosquito, which transmits dengue and Zika viruses, has extended its range into temperate regions that were previously too cool for its survival. Similarly, Malaria transmission has been documented at increasingly high elevations in mountainous regions of Africa and South America. Tick-borne diseases show equally dramatic responses to warming temperatures. Lyme disease, caused by the bacterium Borrelia burgdorferi and transmitted by Ixodes ticks, has expanded its range northward across North America and Europe as milder winters allow tick populations to survive in previously unsuitable areas. The life cycle of these ticks, which requires multiple blood meals over a 2-year period, completes more rapidly in warmer conditions, increasing tick abundance and disease transmission rates. The seasonal activity patterns of disease vectors shift under climate change, often extending transmission seasons and creating year-round disease threats in regions that previously experienced seasonal respites. Mosquito activity periods lengthen as spring arrives earlier and autumn extends later, while warmer winter temperatures may allow some species to remain active throughout the year. These extended activity periods increase the number of pathogen transmission opportunities and can overwhelm the immune systems of host populations adapted to seasonal disease patterns. Host susceptibility to infectious diseases increases under climate stress through multiple physiological and behavioral pathways. Animals experiencing heat stress, drought, or nutritional limitations often show suppressed immune function, making them more vulnerable to pathogen infection and less capable of fighting off diseases. The energetic costs of thermoregulation under extreme temperatures divert resources away from immune system maintenance, creating windows of vulnerability that pathogens can exploit. Coral disease outbreaks illustrate how climate stress predisposes organisms to infectious diseases. Rising ocean temperatures cause physiological stress in corals that compromises their immune defenses and makes them susceptible to bacterial and fungal infections. Coral bleaching events, triggered by thermal stress, often precede disease outbreaks that can kill entire reef systems. The combination of temperature stress and infectious disease creates synergistic effects that exceed the impact of either stressor alone. Wildlife populations face emerging infectious diseases as climate change brings together species that were previously geographically separated. When host species shift their ranges in response to changing climate conditions, they may encounter new pathogens to which they have no evolutionary resistance. Similarly, pathogen ranges may expand to include naive host populations that lack immune defenses against unfamiliar diseases. These novel pathogen-host interactions can trigger devastating population declines or even species extinctions. Amphibian populations worldwide have experienced dramatic declines, partly attributed to the fungal pathogen Batrachochitриum dendrobatidis, which causes the disease chytridiomycosis. Climate change facilitates the spread of this pathogen by creating temperature and moisture conditions favorable for fungal growth and transmission. Amphibians, stressed by changing environmental conditions, become more susceptible to infection, while altered precipitation patterns create the humid conditions that promote pathogen survival and dispersal. Plant diseases also respond to climate change through altered pathogen development rates, host susceptibility, and environmental conditions that favor disease transmission. Fungal plant pathogens often benefit from the warmer, more humid conditions that climate change creates in many regions. Increased atmospheric carbon dioxide levels can alter plant chemistry in ways that either increase or decrease resistance to particular pathogens, depending on the specific plant-pathogen interaction. Forest disease outbreaks exemplify how climate stress predisposes plant communities to devastating pathogen impacts. Drought-stressed trees become more susceptible to fungal infections like those caused by Armillaria root rot or Heterobasidium annosum. These pathogens can kill individual trees or entire forest stands, particularly when trees are already weakened by water stress, heat damage, or other climate-related factors. The mountain pine beetle outbreaks across western North America involve both insect pests and associated fungal pathogens that work together to kill millions of acres of forest. Parasite life cycles often involve complex relationships with multiple host species and environmental stages that are sensitive to temperature and moisture conditions. Many parasites require specific temperature ranges to complete development, and climate change can either facilitate or disrupt these life cycles depending on how conditions change. Parasites with aquatic larval stages may benefit from warmer water temperatures that accelerate development, while those requiring cool, moist conditions may face habitat loss as environments become hotter and drier. The timing of parasite transmission often depends on synchronized life cycles between parasites and their hosts. Climate change disrupts these temporal relationships when parasites and hosts respond differently to environmental cues. If parasites develop faster than their hosts under warming conditions, they may reach transmission stages when hosts are not in appropriate physiological states for infection. Conversely, if host development outpaces parasite development, it may create temporal refugia where hosts escape infection pressure. Immune system function in wildlife populations shows complex responses to climate change that influence disease susceptibility. Chronic stress from unsuitable environmental conditions can suppress immune function through elevated stress hormone levels that inhibit immune cell activity. Nutritional stress, whether from reduced food quality or availability, limits the resources available for immune system maintenance. These immunosuppressive effects make climate-stressed animals more vulnerable to both new and existing pathogens. Social behavior changes under climate stress can either increase or decrease disease transmission rates depending on how animals modify their group interactions. Species that aggregate in remaining suitable habitat patches may experience increased disease transmission due to higher population densities and closer contact rates. Conversely, species that reduce social interactions under stress may experience lower transmission rates for directly transmitted diseases. Zoonotic diseases, those that can transmit between animals and humans, pose particular concerns under climate change because they represent potential threats to both wildlife conservation and human health. Many zoonotic pathogens are maintained in wildlife reservoir populations and transmitted to humans through vector species or direct contact. Climate-driven changes in wildlife distributions, vector ranges, and human-wildlife contact patterns can increase zoonotic disease risks in previously unaffected areas. The emergence of new infectious diseases often involves climate-driven changes that bring together pathogens, vectors, and hosts in novel combinations. Spillover events, where pathogens jump from wildlife to domestic animals or humans, may become more frequent as climate change alters species distributions and increases contact rates between previously separated populations. Understanding these spillover risks becomes increasingly important for both conservation and public health planning. Pathogen evolution accelerates under the selective pressures created by climate change and host range shifts. Pathogens that can adapt quickly to new environmental conditions or novel host species gain significant advantages in changing ecosystems. RNA viruses, with their high mutation rates, show particular capacity for rapid evolution in response to new selective pressures. This evolutionary potential means that pathogen threats may continue to evolve even as climate conditions stabilize. Disease surveillance and monitoring become increasingly important as climate change alters disease patterns and creates new epidemiological risks. Traditional disease monitoring systems, based on historical patterns, may miss emerging threats or fail to detect range expansions of known pathogens. Adaptive surveillance systems that can respond to changing climate conditions and species distributions offer better prospects for early detection and management of disease outbreaks. The management of infectious diseases in wildlife populations requires new approaches that account for climate-driven changes in pathogen ecology. Traditional strategies focused on controlling known diseases in stable environments may prove inadequate for managing emerging diseases in changing ecosystems. Ecosystem-based approaches that maintain habitat connectivity, reduce host stress, and preserve natural predator-prey relationships may provide more effective disease management than pathogen-specific interventions. Understanding disease ecology in a warming world reveals the pervasive influence of pathogens and parasites on ecological communities and the potential for climate change to fundamentally alter these hidden relationships. These disease-driven changes in population dynamics and species interactions create additional selective pressures that influence how organisms adapt and evolve in response to environmental change. Evolution never stops, but it rarely moves fast enough to keep pace with the rapid environmental changes that climate change brings to ecosystems worldwide. While natural selection has shaped life's responses to environmental challenges for billions of years, the current rate of climate change compresses evolutionary timescales in ways that test the adaptive limits of even the most resilient species. Some organisms demonstrate remarkable capacity for rapid evolutionary change, adjusting their physiology, behavior, and life history traits within just a few generations. Others appear locked into evolutionary constraints that prevent adequate responses to shifting environmental conditions. The speed of evolutionary adaptation depends fundamentally on generation time, genetic variation, and the strength of selection pressures imposed by environmental change. Species with short generation times, high reproductive rates, and large population sizes possess the greatest potential for rapid evolutionary responses. Microorganisms, insects, and annual plants can potentially evolve significant adaptations within years or decades, while long-lived species like trees and large mammals may require centuries or millennia for equivalent evolutionary changes. Contemporary evolution, the observation of evolutionary change occurring within human timescales, has become increasingly documented as researchers recognize that evolution operates much faster than previously thought. Climate change creates natural experiments in evolution as species face novel environmental conditions that impose strong selection pressures for adaptation. These evolutionary responses range from subtle physiological adjustments to dramatic changes in life history strategies. Thermal tolerance represents one of the most critical traits under selection in a warming world. Many organisms already live near their thermal tolerance limits, and even modest temperature increases can impose severe physiological stress. Some populations show evolutionary increases in heat tolerance through changes in protein structure, cellular membrane composition, or metabolic pathways that allow function at higher temperatures. However, these adaptations often come with trade-offs that reduce performance under cooler conditions. The red squirrel populations of North America illustrate rapid evolutionary responses to climate change. Over just a few decades, these squirrels have advanced their breeding timing by approximately 18 days to better synchronize with earlier cone production by their preferred food trees. This phenological shift results from both genetic changes and phenotypic plasticity, demonstrating how species can track environmental changes through multiple mechanisms. Phenotypic plasticity, the ability of a single genotype to produce different phenotypes under different environmental conditions, often provides the first line of defense against environmental change. Plastic responses can buy time for populations to evolve genetic adaptations by allowing individuals to survive and reproduce under new conditions. However, plasticity has limits, and extreme environmental changes can push organisms beyond their plastic response ranges. Epigenetic mechanisms provide an additional layer of evolutionary response that operates faster than traditional genetic mutation and selection. Environmental stresses can trigger changes in gene expression patterns that are transmitted to offspring, allowing rapid responses to environmental change without permanent genetic modifications. These epigenetic responses may be particularly important for long-lived species that cannot evolve quickly through traditional genetic mechanisms. Plant responses to elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide demonstrate both the potential and limitations of evolutionary adaptation to climate change. Some plant species show rapid evolution of reduced responsiveness to CO2 enrichment, preventing runaway growth responses that might be maladaptive in nutrient-limited environments. However, these evolutionary responses often involve trade-offs that reduce competitive ability or stress tolerance. Migration timing in birds provides clear examples of heritable evolutionary responses to climate change. Many migratory bird species have evolved earlier spring migration and later autumn departure times in response to shifting seasonal conditions. These changes show genetic components that can be passed to offspring, allowing populations to track changing environmental conditions over multiple generations. Body size changes represent another common evolutionary response to climate change across diverse animal groups. Bergman's rule predicts that animals in cooler climates should be larger than those in warmer climates, and some species show evolutionary size reductions as temperatures warm. These size changes can affect metabolic rates, surface area to volume ratios, and thermal tolerance, providing adaptive advantages under changing climate conditions. The evolutionary responses of pest species to climate change create challenges for agricultural and natural systems. Many crop pests and disease vectors evolve rapidly to exploit new environmental conditions, developing resistance to control measures or expanding their host ranges. The Colorado potato beetle has evolved earlier emergence timing and increased heat tolerance, allowing it to expand its range and increase damage to crop plants. Genetic constraints limit the evolutionary responses possible for many species facing climate change. Traits under strong stabilizing selection may lack the genetic variation necessary for adaptive evolution, while genetic correlations between traits can prevent independent evolution of optimal trait combinations. Small population sizes reduce genetic diversity and limit the raw material available for natural selection. Evolutionary rescue describes scenarios where populations avoid extinction through rapid evolutionary adaptation to changing environmental conditions. This process requires sufficient genetic variation, strong selection pressures, and population sizes large enough to maintain evolutionary potential while surviving environmental stress. Mathematical models suggest that evolutionary rescue is possible for some species, but unlikely for others facing severe climate change impacts. The concept of evolutionary debt describes situations where populations survive environmental changes in the short term but lack the genetic capacity for long-term adaptation. These populations may persist for several generations before accumulated environmental stress and reduced fitness lead to eventual extinction. Understanding evolutionary debt helps explain why some species show delayed responses to environmental change. Gene flow between populations can either enhance or constrain evolutionary responses to climate change. Migration from populations adapted to different environmental conditions can introduce beneficial alleles that enhance local adaptation. However, continued gene flow from maladapted populations can also swamp local adaptation and prevent evolutionary responses to local environmental conditions. Hybridization between closely related species sometimes increases under climate change, as shifting ranges bring previously separated species into contact. These hybridization events can introduce genetic variation that enhances adaptive capacity, but they can also lead to outbreeding depression or the loss of locally adapted gene complexes. The balance between these effects determines whether hybridization helps or hinders evolutionary responses. Assisted gene flow represents a potential conservation strategy for enhancing evolutionary adaptation to climate change. This approach involves deliberately moving individuals between populations to increase genetic diversity and introduce potentially adaptive alleles. However, assisted gene flow must be carefully managed to avoid disrupting existing local adaptations or introducing maladaptive gene combinations. The evolution of drought tolerance in plant populations demonstrates both the potential and challenges of evolutionary adaptation to changing precipitation patterns. Some plant populations show rapid evolution of deeper root systems, smaller leaves, or altered water use efficiency in response to increased drought frequency. However, these adaptations often involve trade-offs with growth rate or competitive ability that limit their effectiveness. Coral evolution provides a particularly urgent example of adaptation limits under climate change. Some coral populations show evidence of evolutionary adaptation to higher temperatures and more acidic conditions, developing tolerance to bleaching-inducing temperatures or maintaining calcification under reduced pH. However, the rate of ocean warming and acidification may exceed the capacity for evolutionary adaptation in many coral species. The role of standing genetic variation in evolutionary responses to climate change depends on whether populations harbor alleles that are beneficial under new environmental conditions. Populations with high genetic diversity are more likely to contain adaptive alleles, while genetically depauperate populations may lack the variation necessary for evolutionary responses. Conservation strategies increasingly focus on maintaining genetic diversity to preserve evolutionary potential. Experimental evolution studies provide insights into the limits and potential of evolutionary adaptation under controlled conditions. Laboratory populations of organisms, like fruit flies and bacteria, can evolve rapidly when exposed to simulated climate change conditions, developing increased heat tolerance, altered development timing, or modified stress responses. However, the simplified laboratory environments may not capture the complexity of challenges facing wild populations. The speed of climate change, relative to generation times, determines whether evolutionary adaptation can track environmental change. Fast reproducing species like annual plants and insects may keep pace with climate change through evolutionary adaptation, while slow reproducing species like trees and large mammals may fall behind. This mismatch between environmental change rates and evolutionary potential contributes to extinction risk for long lived species. Quantitative genetics provides tools for predicting evolutionary responses to climate change based on the heritability of traits and the strength of selection pressures. These predictions suggest that some traits may evolve rapidly under climate change, while others show little evolutionary potential. Understanding these predictions helps identify which species are most likely to adapt successfully and which may require conservation intervention. The limits of evolutionary adaptation become apparent when environmental changes exceed the fundamental physiological or biochemical constraints of life. No amount of evolution can allow organisms to survive temperatures that denature essential proteins or pH levels that prevent basic cellular functions. These absolute limits define the boundaries beyond which evolutionary rescue becomes impossible. Conservation strategies must account for both the potential and limitations of evolutionary adaptation to climate change. Protecting large, genetically diverse populations provides the best foundation for evolutionary responses, while maintaining habitat connectivity allows gene flow and range shifts that can enhance adaptive capacity. However, conservation cannot rely solely on evolutionary adaptation and must also include strategies for reducing environmental stress and facilitating range shifts. Traditional conservation approaches emerged during an era when scientists and managers could reasonably assume that ecosystems would remain relatively stable if protected from direct human disturbances. Protected areas were designed to preserve particular species assemblages or ecosystem types in fixed locations, while restoration efforts aimed to return degraded habitats to some historical reference condition. Climate change fundamentally challenges these static approaches by ensuring that ecosystems will continue changing regardless of protection status, forcing conservationists to reimagine their strategies for a world in constant ecological flux. The concept of shifting baselines pervades conservation planning under climate change. Historical reference conditions that guided traditional restoration and management may no longer be achievable or even desirable if climate conditions have changed beyond the tolerance ranges of historical species assemblages. The oak hickory forests that dominated much of the eastern United States during pre settlement times may be unable to persist under projected future climate conditions, requiring managers to accept transitions to alternative forest types better adapted to warmer, drier conditions. Protected area design faces fundamental challenges when the ecosystems they were created to protect migrate beyond their boundaries. A national park established to preserve Arctic tundra may find itself harboring boreal forest within decades as tree lines advance northward. Coastal reserves designed to protect salt marsh ecosystems may be submerged by rising sea levels, while mountain parks may lose their alpine zones as warming temperatures push suitable habitat beyond available elevation ranges. The principle of representativeness, which guides the selection of protected areas to include examples of all major ecosystem types, becomes problematic when those ecosystem types are rapidly changing or disappearing entirely. Novel ecosystems that have no historical precedent may emerge in protected areas, challenging managers to decide whether to accept these new configurations or intervene to maintain historical conditions. The management of emerging ecosystem types requires new frameworks that can evaluate their conservation value without reference to historical baselines. Climate adaptation strategies for protected areas increasingly focus on maintaining ecological processes rather than preserving specific species compositions. This process-based approach recognizes that species assemblages will change under climate change, but attempts to preserve the underlying ecological functions that support biodiversity and ecosystem services. Maintaining natural disturbance regimes, protecting habitat connectivity, and preserving environmental gradients become more important than protecting particular species lists. Connectivity conservation emerges as a critical strategy for enabling species to track suitable climate conditions across landscapes. Traditional protected area networks often consist of isolated reserves surrounded by human-dominated landscapes that present barriers to species movement. Climate change makes these barriers more problematic because species must move greater distances to track shifting climate zones, requiring corridors and stepping stone habitats that facilitate range shifts. The design of climate corridors requires understanding both the direction and speed of climate change impacts across landscapes. Species generally need to move northward and upslope to track suitable climate conditions, but local topography, land use patterns, and habitat requirements create complex pathways for movement. River valleys may provide natural corridors for some species, while ridgelines facilitate movement for others. Urban areas and agricultural landscapes may require restoration or management to provide functional connectivity. Assisted migration represents one of the most controversial climate adaptation strategies in conservation. This approach involves deliberately moving species beyond their current ranges to areas where climate conditions are projected to become suitable in the future. Assisted migration challenges the fundamental conservation principle of preserving native species in their natural locations, but proponents argue that it may be necessary to prevent extinctions when natural migration rates cannot keep pace with climate change. The risks and benefits of assisted migration vary considerably among species and situations. Moving a single species to a new location may disrupt existing ecological relationships and create invasive species problems, while failing to move climate-threatened species may condemn them to extinction. Successful assisted migration requires extensive research to identify suitable recipient sites, assess ecological risks, and monitor outcomes. The American Chestnut Restoration Program provides an example of assisted migration combined with genetic enhancement to restore a species to portions of its former range. Ex situ conservation, the preservation of species in botanical gardens, zoos, seed banks, and other artificial environments, takes on new importance under climate change. These facilities can maintain genetic diversity from populations that may be lost in the wild, providing insurance against extinction and sources for future reintroduction efforts. Seed banks become particularly valuable for preserving plant genetic diversity from populations adapted to climate conditions that may no longer exist anywhere in the wild. The role of genetic diversity in climate adaptation makes conservation genetics increasingly important for species survival. Populations with higher genetic diversity have greater potential for evolutionary adaptation to changing environmental conditions, while genetically depauperate populations may lack the variation necessary for survival. Conservation strategies must prioritize maintaining genetic diversity through large population sizes, habitat connectivity, and careful management of breeding programs. Ecosystem based adaptation uses natural ecosystems to help human communities adapt to climate change while simultaneously providing biodiversity conservation benefits. Coastal wetlands can provide protection against storm surge and sea level rise while supporting diverse wildlife communities. Forest restoration in watersheds can reduce flood risks while creating habitat corridors for climate displaced species. These strategies demonstrate how conservation and human adaptation goals can be mutually reinforcing. The timing of conservation interventions becomes critical under rapidly changing climate conditions. Traditional conservation planning often operates on decadal timescales, but climate change may require more rapid responses to prevent irreversible ecosystem changes or species extinctions. Early warning systems that can detect ecosystem stress and trigger rapid conservation responses become increasingly valuable for preventing ecological collapse. Adaptive management provides a framework for conservation action under uncertainty about future climate conditions and ecosystem responses. This approach emphasizes learning through management experiments, monitoring outcomes, and adjusting strategies based on new information. Adaptive management acknowledges that conservation strategies may need frequent revision as climate conditions continue changing and new information becomes available about ecosystem responses. The social dimensions of conservation become more complex under climate change as human communities also face displacement and adaptation challenges. Conservation strategies must account for human migration patterns, changing land use pressures, and the need for ecosystem services that support human adaptation. Indigenous communities often possess traditional ecological knowledge that can inform climate adaptation strategies, while their land rights and cultural connections to ecosystems require consideration in conservation planning. Funding mechanisms for conservation must adapt to address the ongoing costs of climate adaptation rather than one time preservation efforts. Traditional conservation funding focused on land acquisition and initial restoration may prove inadequate for the continuous management interventions required under changing climate conditions. Payment for ecosystem services schemes may provide sustainable funding for conservation activities that also support human adaptation to climate change. International cooperation becomes increasingly important for conservation under climate change because species ranges and ecological processes cross political boundaries. Migratory species require coordinated conservation efforts across multiple countries, while climate driven range shifts may move species from one nation's jurisdiction to another's. International agreements and funding mechanisms must evolve to address these transboundary conservation challenges. The integration of climate science into conservation planning requires new tools and expertise that many conservation organizations are still developing. Climate models, species distribution projections, and vulnerability assessments provide essential information for conservation planning, but translating this information into practical management decisions requires interdisciplinary collaboration between climate scientists, ecologists, and conservation practitioners. Monitoring and evaluation systems for conservation must evolve to track ecosystem changes and adaptation outcomes under climate change. Traditional monitoring focused on population trends and habitat conditions may miss important indicators of ecosystem stress or adaptation success. New monitoring approaches must track ecosystem functions, species interactions, and adaptation processes rather than simply counting individuals or measuring habitat area. The legal frameworks governing conservation and environmental protection often assume static ecosystem conditions and may impede necessary adaptation strategies. Laws that require maintaining historical ecosystem conditions may prevent managers from allowing natural transitions to alternative states better adapted to changing climate. Legal reforms may be necessary to provide flexibility for climate adaptation while maintaining environmental protection goals. Private land conservation becomes increasingly important under climate change because much of the landscape scale connectivity required for species migration occurs on private lands. Conservation easements, habitat certification programs, and incentive payments can encourage private landowners to manage their lands in ways that support biodiversity, conservation, and climate adaptation. These approaches require new partnerships between conservation organizations, government agencies, and private landowners. The evaluation of conservation success must shift from measures based on maintaining historical conditions to indicators of ecosystem resilience and adaptation capacity. Successful conservation under climate change may involve accepting some species losses while facilitating the establishment of new species assemblages better adapted to changing conditions. These new success metrics require different values and expectations from both conservation professionals and the public. Understanding conservation in the climate change era reveals the need for fundamental shifts in how society approaches environmental protection and management. These changes in conservation strategy parallel the broader ecological transformations occurring as climate change creates entirely novel ecosystem types with no historical precedent. Climate change creates environmental conditions that have no precedent in recent Earth history, assembling combinations of temperature, precipitation, atmospheric composition, and seasonal patterns that existing species have never before encountered together. These unprecedented conditions give rise to novel ecosystems, communities of organisms that form new associations without historical analogs. These emerging ecological configurations challenge our understanding of how ecosystems function and force us to confront the reality that much of Earth's future biosphere may operate according to rules we have yet to discover. The concept of no-analog climates describes regions where projected future climate conditions fall outside the range of natural variability experienced during recent geological periods. Computer models suggest that tropical regions may experience climates unlike anything that has existed for millions of years, while some current climate types may disappear entirely as global patterns reorganize. These no-analog climates provide the environmental stage upon which novel ecosystems develop their unprecedented biological communities. Novel species assemblages emerge when climate change brings together organisms from different evolutionary backgrounds that previously had little or no interaction. As species track shifting climate zones at different rates and in different directions, they create temporary or permanent communities unlike any that existed historically. Arctic adapted species moving southward may encounter temperate species moving northward, creating transition zones with species combinations that have no evolutionary precedent. The interactions between novel species combinations can produce ecological surprises that defy predictions based on individual species' responses to climate change. Predator prey relationships may form between species that never co evolved together, potentially lacking the behavioral adaptations that typically regulate such interactions. Plant pollinator networks may assemble from species with mismatched timing or morphology, creating unstable mutualisms that could collapse or evolve rapidly toward new stable configurations. Urban ecosystems provide existing examples of novel ecosystem development as they support species assemblages that would never occur in natural environments. Cities create unique microclimates, soil conditions, and disturbance regimes that select for particular combinations of native and non native species. Climate change may make many natural ecosystems more similar to current urban environments, suggesting that urban ecology provides insights into future novel ecosystem function. The hybrid zones that form when previously separated species come into contact due to range shifts represent laboratories for studying rapid ecological and evolutionary change. These zones often produce hybrid individuals with intermediate characteristics that may be better or worse adapted to changing environmental conditions than their parent species. Some hybrid zones may become permanent features of the landscape, creating novel evolutionary lineages adapted to new climate conditions. Ecological release occurs when species encounter environments lacking their traditional competitors, predators, or parasites, allowing them to exploit new ecological opportunities. Climate refugees arriving in new habitats may experience ecological release if their natural enemies cannot track the same climate changes. This release can lead to population explosions and rapid adaptation to new ecological roles that the species never filled in their native ranges. The assembly rules that govern how species come together to form stable communities may not apply to novel ecosystems developing under unprecedented environmental conditions. Traditional ecological theory suggests that communities assemble through predictable processes based on species traits and environmental filtering, but novel ecosystems may follow alternative assembly pathways that produce stable configurations, unlike anything predicted by existing theory. Invasive species often serve as harbingers of novel ecosystem development because they represent examples of organisms establishing in communities where they have no evolutionary history. Many invasive species become integrated into their recipient ecosystems over time, forming new ecological relationships that may persist indefinitely. Climate change may facilitate the establishment of many more invasive species, while also making native species behave more like invaders as they colonize new habitats. The temporal dynamics of novel ecosystem development involve complex transitions as species arrive and establish at different times. Early colonizing species may modify environmental conditions in ways that facilitate or inhibit subsequent arrivals, creating priority effects that influence the final community composition. These assembly sequences may be highly contingent on the order of species arrivals and the environmental conditions present during critical establishment periods. Threshold effects and tipping points become particularly important in novel ecosystems because they may lack the stabilizing feedbacks that maintain historical ecosystem states. Novel communities may be more prone to sudden shifts between alternative stable states because they lack the co-evolved relationships that provide resistance to change. Understanding these thresholds becomes crucial for predicting when novel ecosystems might undergo further rapid transitions. The functional properties of novel ecosystems may differ substantially from historical systems, even when they appear superficially similar. Ecosystem services like carbon storage, water regulation, or nutrient cycling may operate differently in novel communities because the species providing these functions have different ecological traits than the historical species they replace. Some novel ecosystems may provide enhanced ecosystem services, while others may function less effectively than their predecessors. Restoration ecology faces fundamental challenges in novel ecosystem contexts because traditional restoration aims to recreate historical conditions that may no longer be possible or appropriate. Alternative restoration approaches focus on creating functional ecosystems adapted to current and projected future conditions, rather than attempting to recreate historical species assemblages. These novel restoration strategies may combine native and non-native species in new configurations designed to provide desired ecosystem functions. The conservation value of novel ecosystems remains contentious because they challenge traditional notions of naturalness and ecological integrity. Some conservationists argue that novel ecosystems represent degraded conditions that should be restored to historical states, while others contend that they may provide the only viable conservation option under changing climate conditions. Evaluating conservation priorities requires new frameworks for assessing the value of unprecedented ecological configurations. Evolutionary processes accelerate in novel ecosystems as species encounter new selective pressures and potential mating partners. Rapid evolution may allow some species to adapt quickly to novel community contexts, while hybridization between previously separated species may generate new genetic combinations better suited to changing conditions. These evolutionary responses may be essential for the long-term stability of novel ecosystem configurations. The study of fossil records provides some insights into how ecosystems reorganized during past climate changes, revealing that novel species associations have formed repeatedly throughout Earth's history. However, the current rate of climate change and the extent of human landscape modification create conditions that may exceed the capacity for ecosystem reorganization demonstrated in the geological past. Contemporary novel ecosystems may represent truly unprecedented ecological experiments. Prediction becomes increasingly difficult in novel ecosystem contexts because ecological models are typically based on relationships observed in historical systems. The novel environmental conditions and species interactions that characterize these emerging ecosystems may operate according to different rules than those governing historical communities. This uncertainty challenges both scientific understanding and practical management of changing ecosystems. Monitoring novel ecosystems requires new approaches because traditional indicators of ecosystem health are based on comparisons to historical reference conditions that may no longer be relevant. Alternative monitoring frameworks focus on functional indicators like productivity, nutrient cycling, and stability rather than species composition or similarity to historical states. These functional approaches may provide better guidance for managing ecosystems with no historical precedent. The human dimensions of novel ecosystems become increasingly important as people must adapt their relationships with changing environments. Ecosystem services that human communities depend upon may change substantially in novel ecosystems, requiring social adaptations alongside ecological ones. Cultural relationships with landscapes may be disrupted when familiar species assemblages are replaced by novel configurations. The global extent of novel ecosystem development suggests that much of Earth's future biosphere may consist of ecological communities unlike any that have existed in recent history. This prospect requires fundamental shifts in how society thinks about nature, conservation, and environmental management. Accepting novel ecosystems as legitimate expressions of ecological adaptation to changing conditions may be necessary for effective environmental stewardship in the Anthropocene. Resilience thinking provides frameworks for understanding how novel ecosystems might maintain stability despite their unprecedented character. Some novel configurations may prove more resilient to continued environmental change than historical ecosystems, while others may be inherently unstable and prone to further rapid transitions. Understanding these stability properties becomes crucial for predicting the long-term trajectory of ecological change. The emergence of novel ecosystems represents both a challenge and an opportunity for ecological science and environmental management. While these unprecedented communities complicate prediction and management, they also provide natural experiments for understanding fundamental ecological processes under extreme conditions. Studying novel ecosystems may reveal new insights into ecosystem function that could not be gained from studying historical systems alone. Understanding novel ecosystems and ecological surprises reveals the creative potential of ecological processes under changing environmental conditions. These emerging communities represent living laboratories for studying how life adapts to unprecedented challenges, setting the stage for examining the broader implications of these ecological transformations for the future of Earth's biosphere. As we reach the end of our journey through the ecological transformations that climate change brings to Earth's living systems, a profound question emerges. What will the biosphere look like as these changes continue to unfold? The tapestry of life that has evolved over billions of years now faces its most rapid reorganization in human memory, creating a future biosphere that will likely bear only passing resemblance to the one we have known. Understanding this transition requires grappling with concepts of resilience and transformation that extend beyond individual species or ecosystems to encompass the entire web of life on our planet. The concept of planetary boundaries suggests that Earth's biosphere operates within certain limits that maintain the stable conditions necessary for complex life. Climate change pushes several of these boundaries beyond their safe operating spaces, potentially triggering cascading changes throughout Earth's systems. The biosphere that emerges from this transition may function according to different rules, with new patterns of energy flow, nutrient cycling, and species interactions that we are only beginning to glimpse. Biosphere resilience emerges from the redundancy built into ecological systems through millions of years of evolution. Multiple species often perform similar ecological functions, providing insurance against the loss of any single component. This functional redundancy has allowed Earth's biosphere to survive previous mass extinction events and dramatic climate changes, though always with substantial reorganization and the emergence of new evolutionary pathways. The speed of current change challenges this resilience in unprecedented ways. While the biosphere has survived rapid climate changes in the geological past, the current rate of change occurs within centuries rather than millennia, compressing the timescales available for evolutionary adaptation and ecosystem reorganization. This temporal compression tests whether the mechanisms that have previously maintained biosphere stability can operate quickly enough to prevent systemic collapse. Biodiversity loss represents one of the greatest threats to biosphere resilience under climate change. As species extinctions accelerate and ecosystem connections are severed, the functional redundancy that underpins biosphere stability erodes. Each species loss removes not just an individual organism type, but also the unique ecological relationships and functions that species provided. The cumulative effect of these losses may weaken the biosphere's capacity to maintain essential functions under continued environmental stress. Yet the biosphere also demonstrates remarkable creativity in generating new forms of organization under changing conditions. Novel ecosystems represent expressions of this creativity as life finds new ways to organize itself under unprecedented environmental conditions. While these emerging configurations may be unstable initially, some may develop into new forms of biosphere organization that prove more resilient to continued environmental change than historical systems. The role of keystone species and ecosystem engineers becomes increasingly important in shaping the future biosphere. Species that create habitat structure or regulate ecosystem processes exert influence far beyond their numerical abundance. The loss of these critical species can trigger cascading changes that reorganize entire ecosystems, while their preservation or restoration may provide stabilizing influences that help maintain ecosystem function under changing conditions. Evolutionary processes accelerate under the selective pressures imposed by rapid environmental change, potentially generating new forms of life adapted to future Earth conditions. While most species may struggle to evolve quickly enough to track environmental changes, some lineages may undergo rapid diversification that fills ecological roles left vacant by extinct species. These evolutionary radiations could help rebuild biosphere complexity in new configurations. Technology increasingly intersects with natural processes in ways that influence biosphere development. Human activities now affect virtually every aspect of Earth systems, from atmospheric composition and ocean chemistry to the genetic makeup of wild populations. The future biosphere will be shaped by the interplay between natural processes and human interventions, creating hybrid natural technological systems that may be essential for maintaining planetary habitability. The concept of Earth system science recognizes that the biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and geosphere operate as a single integrated system with complex feedbacks between components. Climate change disrupts these feedbacks in ways that could either stabilize or destabilize the entire Earth system. Understanding these system-level dynamics becomes crucial for predicting whether the Earth system will settle into a new stable state or continue oscillating between different configurations. Carbon cycle feedbacks illustrate how biosphere changes can influence the physical climate system. Forests stressed by drought and warming may release more carbon dioxide through respiration and decomposition than they absorb through photosynthesis, accelerating atmospheric carbon dioxide accumulation. Conversely, enhanced plant growth in some regions may increase carbon sequestration, providing negative feedback that moderates climate change. The balance between these positive and negative feedbacks will partly determine how much additional warming occurs. Ocean atmosphere, biosphere interactions create additional layers of complexity in Earth system dynamics. Changes in marine productivity affect atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, while atmospheric changes influence ocean chemistry and circulation patterns that determine marine ecosystem function. The future biosphere will be shaped by these complex three-way interactions between oceanic, atmospheric, and biological processes. The emergence of tipping points and threshold effects adds nonlinearity to biosphere dynamics that makes prediction increasingly difficult. Small additional stresses may trigger large, sudden changes in ecosystem states, while apparently dramatic disturbances may have surprisingly limited effects if they do not cross critical thresholds. Understanding where these thresholds lie becomes essential for managing the transition to future biosphere states. Social ecological systems recognize that human societies are embedded within the biosphere and that social and ecological dynamics interact in complex ways. The future biosphere will be shaped not only by natural processes and climate change, but also by human decisions about land use, resource extraction, conservation, and environmental management. These human choices may determine whether the biosphere transitions gradually to new stable states or undergoes abrupt collapse and reorganization. The concept of planetary stewardship acknowledges that humans now have both the responsibility and the capacity to influence biosphere development. This stewardship role requires developing new forms of knowledge and governance that can guide biosphere management at scales from local ecosystems to the entire planet. The success of planetary stewardship efforts may determine whether the future biosphere supports human civilization and the diversity of life we value. Adaptation strategies for living within a transformed biosphere require fundamental shifts in how human societies relate to the natural world. Traditional approaches based on exploiting stable natural resources may prove inadequate in a world of constant ecological change. Alternative approaches that work with ecological processes and embrace uncertainty may prove more sustainable in the long term. The precautionary principle suggests that in the face of potentially catastrophic and irreversible changes, prudent action requires reducing risks, even when scientific understanding remains incomplete. Applied to biosphere management, this principle argues for aggressive efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, protect biodiversity, and maintain ecosystem functions, even if the precise consequences of their loss remain uncertain. Scenarios for the future biosphere range from optimistic visions of successful adaptation and new forms of biosphere organization to pessimistic projections of widespread collapse and impoverishment. The actual trajectory will likely fall somewhere between these extremes, involving both losses and gains as the biosphere reorganizes under new environmental conditions. Understanding the full range of possibilities helps prepare for an uncertain future. The timescales of biosphere change span from immediate responses to environmental perturbations to evolutionary processes that unfold over millions of years. The future biosphere will reflect changes occurring across all these timescales, from rapid species redistributions and ecosystem reorganizations to slower evolutionary adaptations and geological processes. Managing this multi-temporal complexity requires approaches that can address both immediate needs and long-term sustainability. Hope for the future biosphere lies in the demonstrated resilience of life throughout Earth's history and the emerging understanding of how to work with natural processes rather than against them. While the biosphere of the future may be dramatically different from the one we have known, it may also prove more stable and diverse if current transitions lead to new forms of organization better adapted to Earth's changing conditions. The study of how climate change alters ecology reveals both the fragility and the resilience of life on Earth. As temperatures rise, precipitation patterns shift, and atmospheric composition changes, every aspect of the biosphere responds in ways both predictable and surprising. These responses remind us that we are witnessing not just environmental change, but a fundamental reorganization of life itself. Understanding these changes helps us prepare for a future where the old rules of ecology may no longer apply and where the biosphere continues its ancient dance of adaptation and transformation under new and unprecedented conditions.